Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a story about having sex, not on silk sheets by candlelight, but on a pile of scratchy straw, under a leaky roof, and possibly next to your mother-in-law. Welcome to the awkward, unsexy, and somehow still oddly romantic world of medieval intimacy, where foreplay often meant a nervous glance, a whispered, "Are you awake?" and absolutely zero guarantee of privacy. It was messy, it was clumsy, and yet, it was strangely tender. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always love seeing who's joining this sleepy journey from all around the world. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Let's begin like most medieval love stories did, in a tiny one-room house full of snoring relatives, soot-covered ceiling beams, and at least one chicken far too interested in your business. For the average peasant, there was no such thing as a bedroom. There was just a room, singular, and it did everything. You cooked in it, you slept in it, you gave birth to it, and if you were lucky, you got the corner that wasn't directly under the draft from the roof. In this humble space, love had to be adaptable. The bed was often just a straw mat, sometimes raised. Pillows were rare, bed linens were a luxury, blankets were coarse, the air was cold. And let's not forget, children, grandparents, and sometimes even a goat were likely within arm's reach. And yet, couples still found ways to connect. They became masters of silent signals. A subtle nudge under the covers. A cough that meant, "Not tonight." A second cough that meant, "Well, maybe tonight." There weren't many words. The timing was everything. Some couples even created makeshift privacy using a draped cloth or an overturned barrel. One particularly resourceful pair reportedly built a small wooden partition to keep their toddler from crawling in mid-romance and asking for bread. Even the nobility weren't immune to interruptions. Sure, a noble might have their room, but that room had a rotating cast of servants, grooms, cooks, and occasionally a priest. Privacy had to be requested, scheduled, and even then, not guaranteed. Some records describe newlyweds consummating their marriage in the main hall as a public ceremony, awkwardly witnessed by attendants to validate the union. As you might expect, the church had opinions about all of this. Medieval sex was tightly regulated, especially by church law. There were rules upon rules. No sex on holy days. No sex during Lent, Advent, or other fasting periods. No sex on Wednesdays, or Fridays, or Sundays. And absolutely no sex during daylight hours. A 13th century guidebook listed over 100 days a year as unsuitable for marital relations. If you followed the rules strictly, you had about 1/3 of the chance of getting approved tonight. And even when it was permitted, it wasn't necessarily fun. Pleasure was suspicious. Passion was discouraged. You were expected to approach sex as a chore. Necessary, solemn, and brief. Foreplay? It's not a recognized concept, certainly not recommended. Some theologians warned that too much affection before intercourse could tempt couples into sinful desires. One writer even called kissing the gateway to spiritual downfall. Of course, people ignored all of this whenever they could. Letters, legal testimonies, and church records reveal couples flirting, teasing, and sneaking off during feasts for private moments. One particularly bold woman was fined for throwing a snowball at her husband in an improperly flirtatious way. And the church's teachings? Applied with glorious inconsistency. Technically, any position besides the standard was sinful. But in practice, people experimented. They improvised. They figured things out as humans do in every era, under every rule, no matter what a man in a robe says. Historians still debate whether medieval people were more repressed or relaxed than we think. Some argue that the church's obsession proves society was full of temptation. Others say the flood of rules shows how often people ignored them. But one thing is clear. Despite the cold, the rules, and the crowded living spaces, people still found ways to love. To reach across the straw mat and whisper something sweet. To overlook the dust, the chill, and the awkwardness of living with 6 other people and a confused cow. And try anyway. And honestly, isn't that the heart of it? Even in a world where intimacy was never private, where affection was buried under laws, hay, and occasionally a dead mouse, people still wanted closeness. I still craved touch, laughter, connection, even if it meant having to shove your cousin off the blanket first. Let's say you've passed the shared room, the suspicious goose, and the grandmother snoring in the corner. Congratulations, you've arrived at the medieval bed. Or rather, a slightly cleaner patch of straw disguised as a bed. Now, let's talk mechanics. Not those mechanics. Don't worry, we're keeping this PG. We're talking about where, how, and with what level of comfort medieval couples managed to get close, even though their sleeping arrangements were more like a crowded campsite than a honeymoon suite. The bed in a medieval peasant's home was usually nothing more than a pile of hay or straw tossed on the floor, maybe topped with a linen sheet if you were lucky. There are no box springs, no memory foam, and certainly no embroidered pillows with shy Latin phrases. This straw mattress, affectionately called a palliasse, was often shared by husband, wife, maybe a few children, and possibly the family cat, who refused to sleep anywhere else. Even in slightly wealthier households, beds were still pretty basic. A wooden frame might lift the mattress off the ground, helpful in avoiding dampness, rodents, and the occasional curious piglet. These frames were sometimes carved, sometimes plain. Some beds were built into wall niches or wooden boxes to keep out drafts and hold in warmth. A 13th century chronicler referred to such beds as warming cupboards, though by modern standards, they were more like tiny wooden coffins with visible breath in the air. Sleeping was communal. Children often shared beds with their parents until they were older. Extended family, apprentices, and traveling guests might squeeze in on cold nights. One monk's journal from 1327 described 3 souls, 4 elbows, and no space to breathe, which honestly could pass as a medieval love poem. All of this meant that intimacy wasn't something you waited for. It was something you found, like a pause in the rain or a warm loaf of bread. Precious, fleeting, and occasionally damp. Let's talk bedding. There were no standard mattresses. If you couldn't afford straw, you used dry leaves. If you couldn't find leaves, you bundled up old clothes. Some peasants even slept on wooden planks with nothing but a cloak for warmth. Couples had to get creative. One pair in Normandy reportedly stuffed their mattress with seaweed, which worked surprisingly well until the smell became a problem. Blankets were woolen, heavy, and shared. They weren't washed often. Soap was expensive, and water even more so in winter. So they tended to smell like everything they'd been through. If a blanket could talk, it wouldn't whisper sweet nothings. It would probably sigh and ask for early retirement. In wealthier homes, feather beds were status symbols. But feather beds had their issues too. They attracted lice. They went moldy in damp conditions. And they were often so soft that couples would slowly sink into each other in the middle, creating what one German satirist described as the valley of awkward closeness. Now consider lighting. There wasn't any. Candles were expensive. Oil lamps were smoky. Most peasants went to bed at sunset and relied on moonlight, or nothing. Candlelit intimacy sounds romantic until you remember the only candle you own has melted down to a stub, and you're saving it for childbirth or a priest's visit. So most activities happened in near total darkness, guided by instinct, muscle memory, and the occasional painful elbow to the nose. And noise? Oh, there was plenty of noise. Creaking wood, wind whistling through wall cracks, someone is coughing in the corner, a child rolling over and mumbling in their sleep, livestock shuffling outside. If you were lucky, it all blurred into background noise. If you weren't, it was a full performance, complete with an unintended audience. Still, somehow, couples found moments of connection. Honestly, it was almost poetic. In a world of scarcity, discomfort, and constant interruption, people still reach out to each other in the dark. Still whispered jokes. Still carved initials into bedposts. still smiled quietly afterward and shared the warm patch under the blanket. Historians love to talk about kings, battles, and treaties. But in real life was two people on a straw mat trying not to wake the baby while the wind howled outside. A French peasant woman interviewed in a church court during a marital dispute said her husband could always find space in the straw, even when the bed was full. The phrase became a local proverb, part complaint, part compliment. And then there's the story, possibly apocryphal, of the man who built a high bed for himself and his wife, only to discover that the neighbors could now hear everything through the wall. His solution? Move the bed closer to the fireplace, where the crackling masked most sounds. Romantic? Maybe. Fire hazard? Definitely. Of course, not every story had a happy ending. There were awkward falls from narrow beds, bumped noses on low ceilings, occasional mattress collapses. But these mishaps became part of the memory, part of the charm. And maybe that's the most essential part of all this. It wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about the setting. It was about creating something warm and human in a world that could be cold and rigid. It was about reaching out in the dark and finding someone there. Now that we've settled into the scratchy straw mattress of medieval life, let's invite a third party into this increasingly crowded room, the church. Nothing says romance like a church decree about when, how, and why you're allowed to be intimate with your spouse. Yes, in the Middle Ages, the clergy had strong opinions about everything, including what went on under your blanket. To the medieval mind, sex wasn't just a private act, it was a spiritual act, which meant it came with rules. Let's start with the big one. Sex was only permitted within marriage. That may not be surprising, but the nuance is where things get interesting. It wasn't just limited to married couples, it was supposed to be done with the right intention. And what was that intention? Not love, no connection. It was not a particularly good night after too much mead. Number it had to be for reproduction. The church viewed physical pleasure with deep suspicion. If you enjoyed it too much, you were dangerously close to sin. Some theologians wrote that even married couples could risk damnation if they approached sex with desire rather than duty. Think of it less like cuddling and more like tax season. Necessary, tightly scheduled, and ideally not enjoyed. And then there was the calendar. There were entire days when sex was utterly forbidden. Not during Lent, not during Advent, not on holy days, not on saints' feast days, not on Fridays, not on Sundays, not the night before communion, not right after confession. One particularly thorough monk suggested that more than half the year was off limits. If you were devout and diligent, you had roughly 150 days a year when intimacy was technically allowed. That's assuming no one in your family was sick, pregnant, grieving, or off on pilgrimage. In which case, maybe next year. And these weren't just polite recommendations. They were written down and enforced and preached from pulpits. One bishop wrote a 12-page guide listing the days couples should avoid. Another compared sex within marriage to a form of medicine, useful in small doses, but dangerous if taken too often. Imagine being a humble medieval husband or wife. You finally find a quiet moment. The fire is still burning. The kids are asleep, and even the goat is silent. But as you reach out, your spouse whispers, "Wait, isn't today the feast of Saint Wolfhilda?" Well, that kills the mood. Then there were confessions. People were expected to confess their thoughts, actions, and even impure positions. Yes, some forms of affection were considered holier than others. The missionary position was preferred, everything else was suspect. Anything too experimental, too gleeful, or too mutual raised eyebrows in the confessional booth. Some penitents asked questions that would make a modern therapist blush. Surviving handbooks, written for priests, not the public, list all the sins a married couple might commit. The language was careful, the judgment was not. A 13th century manual warned against uncontrolled embraces, excessive kissing, and disorderly union. Disorderly. One has to wonder what constitutes an order. Another text emphasized that if a couple continued after reproduction was no longer on the table, they were surrendering to lust beastly. Oh dear. And yet people found ways to bend the rules. Some argued that expressing love, even physical love, was a way of honoring God. Others believed the unity between husband and wife reflected the union between Christ and the Church. Perhaps a bit theologically grand, it gave couples a little room to maneuver. Some clergy, often married themselves, wrote treatises in defense of joy within marriage, quietly, carefully. Historians still debate how seriously ordinary people took all this. Did peasants stop everything for all 40 days of Lent? Or did they quietly ignore the rules and avoid bringing it up at confession? There's no clear answer. Maybe some strictly followed the church calendar, others selectively. A few perhaps used forbidden days as a convenient excuse for a much-needed break. And of course, not all regions enforced these rules equally. In some areas, local priests looked the other way for minor violations. In others, they doubled down, publicly shaming couples from the pulpit, or prescribing penance as readily as bread. Speaking of penance, if you were caught breaking the rules, you might be ordered to fast, walk barefoot to church, or recite specific prayers while kneeling on cold stones. For particularly enthusiastic couples, the penance could be extended. You might wonder, did people internalize this guilt? Did they believe desire was sinful? Yes, and no. We have love letters from the 12th and 13th centuries that are passionate, poetic, and steamy. Nobles wrote some by monks. There were plays, songs, and poems celebrating love. Not just chaste love, but romantic, physical love. Troubadours sang of aching hearts and stolen kisses. Some stories told of lovers sneaking away from banquets, hiding in the dark, brushing flour from their sleeves after trysts in the bakery. In other words, while the church preached restraint and control, regular people lived messily and memorably. And honestly, can you blame them? When you work from sunrise to sunset, sleep beside 3 generations of family, and eat the same turnip stew 6 days a week, you can be forgiven for wanting to steal a moment of joy, a moment of warmth, a moment where you're seen not as a laborer or a parent, but as a person. And in the end, that is intimacy, a rebellion against the cold, comfort in the dark, even if the church is watching, especially then. By now, you've probably realized that scheduling intimacy in the Middle Ages wasn't just difficult. It was practically a sacred calculation, and nowhere was this complexity more evident than in the endless list of forbidden days. Because if there was one phrase medieval people heard nearly as often as "Amen," it was probably, "Not tonight, it's a feast day." Let's talk about the liturgical calendar, meant in theory to help medieval Christians align their lives with the rhythms of faith. In practice, it turned intimacy into a kind of spiritual minefield. You see, the church didn't just hand you a Bible, it gave you a checklist, a very long one. First, Lent, 40 days of penance and reflection. No meat, no merrymaking, and no that. Then came Advent, the season leading up to Christmas, during which couples were again encouraged to abstain from sexual relations. Fridays? Forbidden, because of Christ's crucifixion. Sundays? Also, no, because it was the Lord's Day. Feast days? Saints' days? The days leading up to communion? Still no. And just to ensure everyone stayed appropriately anxious, some saints' feast days were treated with extra gravity. A particularly pious French bishop's manual noted that one should avoid intimacy on St. Agatha's Day out of reverence, and perhaps to avoid divine judgment mid-snog. Some historians estimate that over half the calendar year was designated as sexually restricted. This may explain why so many medieval couples had so many children. When they were finally given the green light, they didn't waste time. But let's go deeper. Some bishops even issued ban charts detailing which days were permitted and which were not. These weren't mere suggestions. They were expected to be followed. Couples who knowingly defied them might be ordered to do penance, prayer, fasting, and occasionally even public confession. and enforcement wasn't consistent. In more conservative regions, even married couples were warned not to display too much affection. In more relaxed areas, some parish priests simply shrugged and focused more on whether you showed up for Sunday Mass. Still, many people did take the rules seriously. One surviving confession record from a German parish in the late 14th century features a woman tearfully admitting that she and her husband had been intimate during Lent. The priest prescribed 3 days of fasting and a week of whispered prayers. Her husband, less tearful, confessed the same and was told to recite 3 psalms and chop firewood for the monastery. Equality wasn't precisely the theme of the age, but not everyone followed the rules quietly. Some couples found loopholes. A popular belief, never officially approved but indeed passed along with knowing winks, was that it didn't count as a sin if you didn't enjoy it. So couples would sometimes make an effort to appear, at least outwardly, miserable during intimacy. No smiling, no sighing, just a solemn Amen at the end. Others took advantage of the fact that the church couldn't monitor everyone simultaneously. In isolated villages where priests only visited a few times a year, enforcement was, at best, uneven. Some families developed their rhythms, following the spirit of the law, but not always the letter. "We don't do that during Lent," one man was said to remark, "unless it's raining and no one's watching." Historians still debate whether these rules were truly about spiritual purity, or simply the church's attempt to control every aspect of life. Some argue it was about channeling desire into socially acceptable paths, keeping focus on family, not pleasure. Others say it was about power, reminding people that the church had the final word, even in their most private moments. And to be fair, not all religious authorities were equally strict. Some monks wrote surprisingly nuanced commentaries acknowledging the role of affection in marriage. A few even hinted that romantic love, not just duty, could be acceptable and praiseworthy. Carefully worded, theologically cautious, but still. Progress. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the mess. Many couples likely internalized the rules, adjusted their expectations, and planned accordingly. Others smiled politely at the priest and did whatever they wanted once the door was closed. And then there were the rebels, the ones who openly ignored the church calendar and lived on their terms. A court record from Florence references a couple frequently seen embracing on fasting days and unwilling to accept correction. Their punishment? A fine, and possibly the admiration of their neighbors. So what are we to make of all this? Medieval intimacy, in many ways, was a negotiation. Not just between partners, but between people and their God. Between desire and duty. Between affection and abstinence. Between a warm fire and a cold calendar. Because even with all the restrictions, the sermons, the guilt, and the growing list of saints with suspiciously timed feast days, people still loved. They still reached for each other in the dark. I still found ways to whisper, still carved out tender moments amid chores, prayers, and plagues. And in doing so, they remind us of one timeless, slightly rebellious truth. Love doesn't always follow the rules. Sometimes it slips between the calendar lines, tiptoes past the confessional, and quietly lives in the spaces no decree can touch. Now, let's enter a place where honesty is mandatory, awkwardness is guaranteed, and privacy is merely an illusion. The medieval confessional. If you thought the church's rules on intimacy were strict, just wait until you hear the questions priests were encouraged to ask, and the details the faithful were expected to share. Confession in the Middle Ages wasn't just a polite whisper behind a screen. It was a formal, face-to-face exchange, often with someone who knew your family, your farm, and the childhood nickname you never lived down. The priest wasn't just your spiritual guide. He was sometimes your neighbor, your cousin, or the man who once saw you fall into a puddle chasing a runaway goose. And yet, you were expected to sit down and confess your most private actions and thoughts in detail. Clergy were supplied with manuals, actual instruction books, on conducting a proper confession. These texts didn't hold back. They included sample questions for priests to ask about a person's sexual behavior. When, how often, with whom, and in which position. One such manual, written by a 14th century monk, listed over 60 different sins of the flesh a confessor should inquire about. The tone was gentle, but the content, invasive, and surprisingly thorough. Did you lie with your spouse in an uncontrolled manner? Did you enjoy it more than you should have? Did your thoughts stray to lustful images? Did you embrace too often? Speak sweetly? Laugh during it? Yes, laughing during sex was discouraged. God disapproved of giggling under the blankets. Now imagine you're a poor farmer's wife, kneeling in a cold stone chapel, trying to explain to your priest why you enjoyed last Tuesday. And yes, you asked for it. And no, you didn't feel guilty then. At least not until now. Some confessors were gentle. They listened quietly, granted absolution, and assigned penance with compassion. Others were less kind, demanding, scolding, even shaming. It depended on the priest, and the parish, and maybe whether or not he'd had breakfast. The strangest part? Many people wanted to confess, not because they enjoyed reliving every intimate detail, but because they genuinely feared for their souls. The medieval worldview was deeply spiritual. Salvation mattered. Heaven and hell weren't abstract. They were urgent, real, and imminent. So, while admitting you'd kissed your husband too eagerly might seem absurd to us today, to a medieval woman, it could have felt like the difference between eternal peace and something much worse. And it wasn't just women under scrutiny. Men were expected to explain their excesses, too. Did you lead your wife into temptation? Did you pressure her? Did you speak indecently? One confessional guide even asked whether a man had looked at his wife with lust rather than respect, as if that line could be drawn in the dark. Some recorded punishments feel random by modern standards. One man confessed to overly enthusiastic hugging and was told not to drink ale for a week. Another, guilty of excessive kissing, had to walk barefoot to Mass for 3 days. A third, who enjoyed seductive talk before intimacy, was assigned to sleep on the cold floor for 7 nights. Harsh? Maybe. But what's fascinating is how people responded. Not all penitents accepted guilt and punishment passively. Some negotiated. Some confessed selectively. Some even argued. One excellent court record from southern France tells of a woman accused of being overly affectionate, who told her priest flatly, "At least I'm not like my neighbor," and pointed directly at her. Historians are still puzzled by these confession records, not just for what they reveal about sex, but for what they say about trust. Despite the invasive nature of confession, many people took it seriously. They wanted to be good. They tried to do the right thing, even if they weren't always sure what that was anymore. The confessional stopped being a place of punishment and became a place of vulnerable honesty. Still, some scholars argue that these manuals reveal less about actual behavior and more about clerical imagination. After all, many of the sins listed seem strangely specific, almost suspiciously so. Do you think about your neighbor's thighs while threshing wheat? Sir? That's weirdly vivid. The line between guidance and projection may have been thinner than we thought. One thing is clear. The church wasn't just concerned with what you did. It wanted to shape how you felt about it. Even in marriage, sex was to be regulated, scrutinized, and tinged with guilt. If it felt too good, it probably was. But of course, people didn't stop living, or loving, or quietly laughing behind closed doors. There were letters from husbands to wives, full of affection and longing. Poems were tucked inside prayer books about stolen kisses, laughter under the moonlight, and whispered, "Don't tell anyone," in the dark. Because no matter how closely the confessor listened, he couldn't hear everything. And even in a world where joy was suspect and privacy was rare, people held tight to their secrets. They still reached for one another in the long nights, still knew that some confessions were meant for just 2 people, and maybe a few sleeping chickens nearby. Let's slip past the monastery walls and into the cloister courtyard, where vows of chastity echo down stone corridors, and the air is thick with incense and sometimes temptation. Despite their vows and devotion, monks and nuns were still very much human, and medieval monasteries weren't always as pure as their reputations would suggest. In theory, monastic life was one of spiritual dedication, humility, and complete abstention from physical pleasure. Those who joined religious orders, whether Benedictine, Cistercian, Franciscan, or others, were expected to abandon worldly desires. They took vows of poverty, obedience, and, most relevant to tonight's story, chastity. But in practice, cloistered life didn't always protect against the occasional longing glance across the dining table. Let's start with the basics. Many monks and nuns didn't join out of pure piety. Some were noble families' youngest sons or daughters, placed in monasteries because they had no claim to inheritance. Others were sent as children, sometimes as young as 7, without much say. That means you had entire communities of people, many of them relatively young, living together in close quarters, forbidden to marry, forbidden even to think lustful thoughts, and given absolutely nothing but time. Time to pray. Time to reflect. It's time to fall in love with the new night janitor accidentally. The rules were strict. No physical contact. Men and women were to be strictly separated. Monks did not speak to nuns. Nuns did not talk to monks. There were gates, walls, fences. Stone chapels are standing between them like moral referees. And yet, temptation found a way. Surviving letters from abbots complain of inappropriate friendships between novices. Records exist of monks scaling walls, of nuns sneaking out at night. One especially inventive group of monks in Germany built a secret tunnel connecting their monastery to a nearby convent. When discovered, they claimed it was for book exchanges. Arguably, it is one of the more charming euphemisms in history. A nun was once caught hiding a local carpenter under her bed in England. When questioned, she said he was repairing the floor. The floor took 3 weeks to fix. The rules around thoughts were even stricter. Monks and nuns were expected to confess not just actions but desires. A dream. A daydream. A passing thought could be cause for penance. One monastic manual asked confessors if novices were harboring images unbefitting a servant of God. You can imagine how vague and oppressive that became. And yet for some, the monastery was the only place they ever felt affection. Within those walls, relationships formed, sometimes as friendships, sometimes not. Scholars still debate the nature of these connections. Were they innocent, romantic, simply the result of deep loneliness? Historians argue whether the strict rules encouraged repression or made connections more intense. One 13th century nun wrote to her confessor, "I long to be pure. I long to be silent. But when I see her across the garden, my prayers become useless." It's hard to read that and not feel the weight of human emotion pressing against rigid expectations. Not all orders were equally strict. The Cluniacs, for instance, were known for elaborate rituals and relative luxury. Some say it led to a more relaxed attitude toward discipline. The Carthusians, on the other hand, practiced near total silence. One Carthusian monk wrote in his journal that he hadn't spoken aloud in 6 months, except once, to sneeze. We hope it was worth it. And not all monasteries were isolated. Some were nestled in bustling towns, next to taverns and markets. That meant monks and nuns were constantly surrounded by reminders of the world they'd sworn to leave behind. One nun wrote of smelling toasted bread through the monastery wall and feeling a hunger not for food. That line alone could launch 1,000 sonnets. Of course, the church didn't ignore these tensions. Councils were held, rules were updated, the walls were reinforced. But still, the rumors persisted. Tales of secret births, love letters tucked inside psalters, stolen kisses behind chapel doors. Some were surely exaggerated, others less so. The line between legend and memory is always thin. But here's the important part. These stories weren't always shameful. Some monks wrote love poems. Some nuns composed songs, and hymns were also love songs. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were expressions of longing, of connection, of humanity. Because even behind walls, beneath veils and vows, people felt. They still hoped, still dreamed, I still imagined what it might be like to touch someone's hand and not pull away. And while many remained devout and celibate their entire lives, they carried an inner world of questions no confession could entirely erase. The medieval monastery wasn't perfect. It was a place of ideals, of striving, of struggle. And at the heart of that struggle was the same force that drives us all: desire. Not just physical, but emotional. The longing to be seen, to be known, to be held, even once, even in prayer. So when we picture monks chanting in candlelit halls or nuns walking through herb gardens, let's remember the fuller picture. They were human, wrapped in wool, wrestling with silence, and sometimes with love. Now let's step outside the cloister and into the village square, where love was less about vows and more about opportunity. Because for the average peasant, sex wasn't governed by treatises or theological manuals. It was ruled by hunger, weather, and whether or not the hayloft was already occupied. Peasants lived complex lives. From sunrise to sunset, they toiled, planting, harvesting, feeding animals, mending tools, and occasionally chasing down that one rogue pig who always knew how to open the gate. Their days were full, their hands were rough, and their backs were sore. But even amid all that sweat and dirt, romance bloomed. Or at least, the medieval version of romance. In peasant communities, there was no genuine concept of privacy. Homes were small, often with a single smoky room with a thatched roof and a central hearth. Entire families lived, ate, slept, and sometimes loved in the shared space. If a couple wanted to be alone, they had to improvise. Which brings us to the hayloft. Oh yes, the hayloft. Humble, scratchy, mildly fragrant, and just high enough off the ground to suggest secrecy. Countless young lovers likely shared nervous first kisses in the dry quiet of a barn, with a goat watching suspiciously from below. And while it wasn't the most comfortable venue, it was, for many, the most private one available. Courtship among peasants was often informal, practical, and guided by community norms rather than law or church doctrine. Couples would flirt during planting season, steal glances at market day, and sneak off after feasts. Young men might offer tokens, an apple, a ribbon, or a handful of nuts, yes, seriously, to show affection. A girl who accepted might later invite him to walk her home. And from there, if the moon was bright and the chickens weren't alarmed, one thing might lead to another. There was a tradition in some parts of Europe called bundling. Sounds cute, right? In practice, it involved a man and woman lying together, fully clothed or wrapped in separate blankets, so they could talk, connect, and maybe kindle romance. In theory, it was chaste. In practice, let's just say the outcome often depended on whether anyone else was home. Some communities allowed this as a sort of supervised intimacy. Parents might allow a young couple to bundle in the same bed, especially if they were courting seriously. It was like the medieval version of, you can stay over, but the door stays open. Except there were no doors. Or walls. It was just everyone pretending they weren't listening. The line between courtship and consummation was often fuzzy. In many places, a couple was considered informally married the moment they slept together, especially if it was followed by cohabitation. The church encouraged formal ceremonies, but such rituals often came later among peasants, after the baby was born, after the fields were sown, or after the village priest visited. Historians still debate how widespread premarital sex was among peasants. Some argue it was common and widely accepted as long as it led to marriage. Others believe communities were stricter, with expectations of chastity, until formal vows were exchanged. The truth, as usual, probably sat somewhere in the middle, depending on the region, the season, and the temperament of the local priest. There are legal records, many, in fact, of couples being fined for fornication. But interestingly, the punishment was often light: a small fee, a public apology, or the requirement to marry. One woman in a 14th century English village was fined for lying with her betrothed before the wedding feast. Her response: "We were hungry and married enough." Honestly, iconic. And speaking of hunger, desire and physical need were often interwoven with real scarcity. Food was not guaranteed. Warmth was not guaranteed. But affection? even fleeting, clumsy affection. That was a comfort people could reach for in the dark, a moment of softness in a life of toil. In harsh winters, couples slept close for warmth. Shared body heat was as practical as it was intimate. Children, animals, and elders often shared the same sleeping space, but couples still carved out small islands of connection. A whispered joke, a gentle squeeze, a shared blanket pulled a little tighter. One folkloric tale from the Low Countries tells of a woman who made her husband a love porridge using extra honey and fennel seeds. It was meant to rekindle his passion after a long, cold season. Did it work? Well, according to the story, they had twins the following spring. And yet, not all stories were sweet. Consent was a complicated, often invisible concept in peasant life. Power imbalances weren't limited to kings and courtiers. A landlord could coerce a tenant's daughter. A master could pressure a servant. These stories are more complex to trace, but court records occasionally hint at abuses swept under the rug or quietly resolved with payments or marriages. Despite this, communities often protected their own. A young man who took advantage of a girl and refused to marry her could be publicly shamed, fined, or, in some cases, beaten by the girl's family. Marriage wasn't just about love. It was about honor, property, and the fragile balance of trust between neighbors. And yet, through all the rules, the dirt, the gossip, and the goats, peasant love endured. They didn't have lace poetry or privacy, but they had hands calloused by the same tools. They had backs bent by the same burdens. And in the quiet of night, after the embers dimmed, they had each other. Not always forever, not always without complication, but real, rough, warm, and, for just a moment, untouched by rules or ritual. Just two people tangled in straw and glad to be alive. In the Middle Ages, people didn't marry for love. They married for geopolitics. No, you didn't mishear that. When two people came together not for romantic glances, but because the bride's father wanted to trade for a strong cow, and the groom's family promised not to let their pigs ruin the crops again, you know it wasn't a love story. It was a business deal. And sometimes, you were the merchandise wrapped in a wedding dress. Picture this. You've just come of age. To your parents, that doesn't mean freedom to fall in love or discover yourself. It means it's time to take you to market. Not a literal one, but close enough. Maybe a family meeting, where wedding invitations are exchanged like prized seeds. There are deals, promises, and of course, prices. For the nobility, marriage was a living chess game. A princess might be married off just to secure a strip of borderland. A young baron could wed an older wife because her family owned a private army. Love? That came later, if at all. Sometimes people get married without ever meeting. It was all arranged through letters, messengers, and sometimes paintings that flattered more than reality. Many noblemen were horrified when their new bride stepped out of the carriage, looking very little like the portrait. What about peasants? You'd think they had more freedom. Maybe a bit, but not much. In the countryside, marriages still depended on pigs. Not kidding. The wedding might happen if the groom's family helped plow your field last harvest, or the bride's hens laid bigger eggs than average. Sometimes two families needed to smooth over a feud about fence lines, which was reason enough to marry off their kids. A form of rural diplomacy, sealed with wildflowers and a wedding cake made from last season's wheat. Don't expect much romance. Lifetime promises were often wrapped in phrases like, "We won't take back the cow from last year if your son stops plowing our field on Sundays." Love, if it came at all, usually arrived after the wedding. At first, you might not even like your spouse. You could argue over who gets the warmer spot by the fire. But over time, you raise children together, survive winters, dodge plagues, and mutually hate the same gossiping neighbor. Affection grows, slowly, like mold on week-old bread. Here's the twist. Under church law, a marriage was considered valid if two people said "I do" to each other. No priest required. So technically, Two young lovers could sneak into the forest, make vows, and boom, they were married. In real life, though, such marriages could be easily denied without witnesses, especially if one of them later met someone richer. That's why couples often held hand-fasting ceremonies, literally tying their hands together with cord, symbolizing their bond. It was sentimental but easy to undo if things didn't work out. Then there was the matter of dowry. In negotiations, the bride's family would offer money, land, chickens, or a strong donkey. It was a form of insurance, ensuring their daughter wouldn't be mistreated, or at least could return if the other side went bankrupt. Suppose a bride had no dowry. Good luck. She might marry someone with nothing but a torn hat and dreams of becoming a blacksmith. Now let's talk choice. Do you think you could say no? Not so fast. Among nobles, refusing a suitor might cost your father his land, job, or head. And if you were a peasant? Turning down the farmer's son across the river might mean no one would lend your family a plow come spring. Sometimes young girls had to marry men twice their age because they owned 3 fields and a working bread oven. Love? Number. But hey, warm bread. Men didn't have it easy either. They were sometimes forced to marry women of strategic value, like the brewer's daughter, even if she had a throwing habit, or someone famous for awful soup, but her dad is loud at the marketplace. So both sides entered marriage like a seasonal trade. One side had grain, the other had pigs, and in between was a vow to live together until the land goes dry, the ox dies, or one of us gets fed up first. Were there marriages for love? Sure. But they were as rare as a summer without flies. It raised suspicion about whether two people truly loved each other before the wedding. Parents would ask, "What do you see in them?" Neighbors would whisper, "It's probably witchcraft." Because back then, if you liked someone too much, something must be wrong. Medieval marriage was a complicated contract. Food, livestock, social standing, and family honor, all mixed like a pot of leftover stew on a Monday. But if you were lucky, after years of tolerating each other, you might learn to laugh together, sit by the fire, watch a stray chicken wander into the house, and think, well, this isn't so bad after all. In the Middle Ages, people didn't marry for love. They married for geopolitics. No, you didn't mishear that. When two people came together not for romantic glances, but because the bride's father wanted to trade for a strong cow, and the groom's family promised not to let their pigs ruin the crops again, you know it wasn't a love story. It was a business deal. And sometimes, you were the merchandise wrapped in a wedding dress. Picture this. You've just come of age. To your parents, that doesn't mean freedom to fall in love or discover yourself. It means it's time to take you to market. Not a literal one, but close enough. Maybe a family meeting, where wedding invitations are exchanged like prized seeds. There are deals, promises, and of course, prices. For the nobility, marriage was a living chess game. A princess might be married off just to secure a strip of borderland. A young baron could wed an older wife because her family owned a private army. Love? That came later, if at all. Sometimes people get married without ever meeting. It was all arranged through letters, messengers, and sometimes paintings that flattered more than reality. Many noblemen were horrified when their new bride stepped out of the carriage, looking very little like the portrait. What about peasants? You'd think they had more freedom. Maybe a bit, but not much. In the countryside, marriages still depended on pigs. Not kidding. The wedding might happen if the groom's family helped plow your field last harvest, or the bride's hens laid bigger eggs than average. Sometimes two families needed to smooth over a feud about fence lines, which was reason enough to marry off their kids. A form of rural diplomacy, sealed with wildflowers and a wedding cake made from last season's wheat. Don't expect much romance. Lifetime promises were often wrapped in phrases like, "We won't take back the cow from last year if your son stops plowing our field on Sundays." Love, if it came at all, usually arrived after the wedding. At first, you might not even like your spouse. You could argue over who gets the warmer spot by the fire. But over time, you raise children together, survive winters, dodge plagues, and mutually hate the same gossiping neighbor. Affection grows, slowly, like mold on week-old bread. Here's the twist. Under church law, a marriage was considered valid if two people said "I do" to each other. No priest required. So technically, two young lovers could sneak into the forest, make vows, and boom, they were married. In real life, though, such marriages could be easily denied without witnesses, especially if one of them later met someone richer. That's why couples often held hand-fasting ceremonies, literally tying their hands together with cord, symbolizing their bond. It was sentimental but easy to undo if things didn't work out. Then there was the matter of dowry. In negotiations, the bride's family would offer money, land, chickens, or a strong donkey. It was a form of insurance, ensuring their daughter wouldn't be mistreated, or at least could return if the other side went bankrupt. Suppose a bride had no dowry. Good luck. She might marry someone with nothing but a torn hat and dreams of becoming a blacksmith. Now let's talk choice. Do you think you could say no? Not so fast. Among nobles, refusing a suitor might cost your father his land, job, or head. And if you were a peasant? Turning down the farmer's son across the river might mean no one would lend your family a plow come spring. Sometimes, young girls had to marry men twice their age because they owned 3 fields and a working bread oven. Love, number. But hey, warm bread. Men didn't have it easy either. They were sometimes forced to marry women of strategic value, like the brewer's daughter, even if she had a throwing habit. Or someone famous for awful soup, but her dad is loud at the marketplace. So both sides entered marriage like a seasonal trade. One side had grain, the other had pigs, and in between was a vow to live together until the land goes dry, the ox dies, or one of us gets fed up first. Were there marriages for love? Sure. But they were as rare as a summer without flies. It raised suspicion about whether two people truly loved each other before the wedding. Parents would ask, "What do you see in them?" Neighbors would whisper, "It's probably witchcraft." Because back then, if you liked someone too much, something must be wrong. Medieval marriage was a complicated contract. Food, livestock, social standing, and family honor, all mixed like a pot of leftover stew on a Monday. But if you were lucky, after years of tolerating each other, you might learn to laugh together, sit by the fire, watch a stray chicken wander into the house, and think, well, this isn't so bad after all. When you think of the intimate life of medieval nobility, you might picture a private space glowing with candlelight, velvet drapes, and thick stone walls that muffle sound. In reality, it was nothing like that. Living in a castle didn't mean privacy. On the contrary, it was an environment where every sound could be overheard by servants, guards, housekeepers, and sometimes even a shoemaker napping in the hallway. In aristocratic households, bedrooms were rarely the private domain of two people. Servants often slept by the door for quick service. Some even slept at the foot of the bed, not because the masters needed companionship, but because serving was their duty. This meant that if a couple wanted to be intimate, they had to move like a covert operations team. No creaking bed, no dropped objects, no heavy breathing, and absolutely no sweet nothings, unless they wanted the entire castle gossiping by breakfast. Beyond the ever-present staff, religious expectations also weighed on married life. In many households, intimacy was only acceptable for reproductive purposes and had to be carried out in a solemn spirit. If someone made too much noise at night, they might be questioned by a nosy matron or even a concerned priest the next day. Clever couples came up with excuses to send their attendants away. Urgent errands to check on honey, or summon someone to the wine cellar. But seasoned servants weren't so easily fooled. They might pretend to leave, then quietly stand by the door, ready to record everything with their disturbingly sharp memory. It wasn't just sounds. Sights could also betray you. In some high-profile royal weddings, consummation requires a witness. Not someone standing right at the bedside, of course, but someone nearby turned away, close enough to confirm that the deed had been properly done. Even kings and queens weren't exempt. Their private chambers were constantly visited by maids bringing tea or courtiers delivering secret messages. If a royal couple wanted true privacy, their only option was to be quick, quiet, and pray no one was eavesdropping behind the screen. Worse still, many castles were built around inner courtyards, where sound echoed everywhere. A sneeze from the upper floor could answer a quiet cough in one room. In such conditions, a whisper between spouses could become tomorrow's breakfast table headline. Newcomers to noble life were often shocked. They weren't used to constant knocks at the door or guards pacing nearby in the dead of night. Being intimate meant learning to communicate with glances, gestures, and sometimes prearranged signals. Some sent handwritten notes, tucked messages under pillows, and hid them in mirror boxes to avoid prying eyes. Others created their secret languages, where each flower, scarf color, or knock pattern held a coded meaning. They carved out moments of quiet connection in the harsh light of constant exposure. It's also worth noting that, in noble circles, love was sometimes performative. Some couples made a point of being heard to assert that their marriage was strong. A loud night in the bedroom could be a good sign, proof that the household was thriving. The servants knew, the guards heard, and the kitchen staff whispered. But it all contributed to the family's public reputation. Still, there were plenty of awkward moments. A servant might barge in without knocking. Someone lingering in the hallway might hear more than they bargained for. A queen might pretend to sleep while the king hosted a lady friend in the middle of the night. Of course, no one said anything, except perhaps with a slightly saltier porridge the next morning. Couples who truly loved each other often chose quiet hours, just before dawn or late at night after a feast. They might steal a kiss behind a door, slip a handkerchief with a gentle squeeze, or exchange a glance heavy with unspoken meaning. These subtle gestures became precious in a world full of watchful eyes and keen ears. There were no locks, soundproof curtains, or do not disturb signs. And yet, because of that, affection had to travel through subtler, more meaningful paths. Instead of words, a sprig of rosemary under a pillow. Instead of a public embrace, a cup of warm water is placed by the bed. A noble bedroom in the Middle Ages wasn't just a sleeping place. It was where secrets were kept, and fragile love stories had to fight to survive. Intimacy became the most refined art of silence, and shared glances in a society where even privacy had an audience. If you think intimacy in the Middle Ages was influenced only by emotion, health, or circumstance, then look at the calendar. In that world, calendars weren't just for tracking planting seasons or feast days. They were also used as highly detailed tools to regulate when married couples could be intimate. And by detailed, we mean so specific you might ask, is there any day left when it's allowed? Imagine you're a married couple in the 13th century. It's a chilly night, the fire's warm, the kids are asleep, and you decide it's the perfect time to be close. But wait, it's Wednesday. In some regions, Wednesday is a forbidden day. No problem. Do you think we'll wait for the weekend? But Friday is a fasting day and the day of Christ's Pan. Saturday is preparation for Sunday, and Sunday is the Lord's Day, not a time for earthly pleasures. You sigh. Maybe Monday? Well, if it's the start of Lent, no luck. If it's Advent season, no. If it's a saint's feast day, guess what? Still no. The medieval church had plenty of opinions about sex, and they weren't shy about writing them directly into the liturgical calendar. Some records list nearly 200 days each year when intimacy was considered inappropriate, including all of Lent, 40 days, all of Advent, roughly 4 weeks, every major and minor feast, fasting days, and risky times like menstruation, postpartum periods, and even full moons. Why so many restrictions? Part of it was the belief that self-restraint in physical pleasure brought one closer to God. Marital sex was to be undertaken only for procreation, and even then, carried out solemnly, without enjoyment. The church feared that if people took too much pleasure in physical acts, they'd neglect their spiritual duties. There was also fear of consequences. People believed that intimacy on forbidden days could produce sickly, cursed, or malformed children. Some even told tales of a baby born with strangely shaped ears, because the parents couldn't wait until after Easter. As a result, many couples had to plan intimacy with the same precision they might plan planting crops. They'd consult the church calendar, seek their priest's counsel, and calculate acceptable days, hoping the mood would still be there after 3 weeks of abstinence. Of course, not everyone followed the rules to the letter. Rural folk, used to letting their oxen determine the day's pace, often had a more flexible view. Many just nodded politely when the priest listed the forbidden days, then quietly ignored him. But to avoid being caught, they had to be discreet, because a complaint could mean public shaming or a 3-hour personal sermon outside the church. Some found creative loopholes. They chose gray areas just after midnight, before dawn, or moments after a festival ended, but before the church bells rang. These twilight hours weren't explicitly forbidden and might go unnoticed. Some lenient priests acknowledged that marital relations couldn't be confined to April and October. For the nobility, however, the scrutiny was real. They had confessors, spiritual advisors, and monks under the same roof. One noble couple was once reprimanded for appearing too cheerful on Good Friday. Suspicion arose when a servant saw them smiling near a window at dusk. Clearly too much joy for such a solemn day. This led to a strange side effect. When sex was permitted, couples made the most of it. Some accounts described them preparing for a market day, cleaning the room, heating water, laying flowers, and telling servants not to disturb them, because after that, they might have to wait another 40 days. In this context, sex became a sort of ceremonial event, rare, deliberate, and slightly absurd. A husband might say, "Tomorrow's one of the allowed days, don't forget." And the wife might reply, "I know. I polished the candlestick yesterday." It is not exactly romantic by modern standards, but it is organized. Medieval medicine didn't help much either. Some physicians claimed that intimacy during a waning moon disturbed the spleen. Others said if the moon rose on the left, you had to wait until it rose on the right to maintain cosmic balance. Science was shaky, but the anxiety was real. Then there were the odd rules, like bans on intimacy for 3 nights after eating fish, because fish was a cold food and incompatible with hot activities, or prohibitions after eating onions because they allegedly upset your guardian angel's mood. Meanwhile, people still had to live and love under these bizarre frameworks. Some couples marked green light days on their calendars like harvest dates. Others hid cheat sheets under their pillows to track when they were allowed. Despite all the restrictions, people still found ways to maintain affection, even just a quick touch or a smile during prayer. No matter how many forbidden days, bells, or disapproving glances from the priest or the neighbor, people always find a way to love, connect, and feel human, even when hemmed in by faith, tradition, and a calendar thick with red X's. If you've ever watched a movie, read a comic, or visited a museum with a medieval theme, chances are you've come across the image of a bizarre object, the chastity belt. A metal contraption, often made of iron, with locks, hinges, and a design that looks tailor-made to terrify. The story goes that medieval men would lock their wives into these devices before heading to the crusade, carrying the key as a symbol of honor and control. It sounds very medieval, harsh, moralistic, and controlling. There's just one small problem. That story is mainly made up. Yes, the idea of an iron underwear set locked up like a bank vault wasn't a common practice in the Middle Ages, and it very likely didn't exist in real life. Most chastity belts displayed in museums were crafted during the Renaissance, or even as late as the 19th century, hundreds of years after people imagined they were being used across Europe. What's surprising is that even medieval texts, which weren't shy about discussing intimate matters, barely mention them. There are no records of chastity belts in legal documents, confessions, or the daily diaries of monks, nobles, or peasants. If they were as widespread as today's pop culture implies, surely someone would have written something about them. So, how did this myth become so widespread? Partly thanks to a blend of misinterpretation, satire, and later obsession. During the Renaissance, especially the 18th century, Scholars and artists became fixated on portraying the Middle Ages as dark, prudish, and weird. They created mock-ups of bizarre objects to either parody the past or emphasize male dominance, and these were photographed, illustrated, displayed, and eventually believed. Some 19th century museums competed to display chastity belts with lurid descriptions, and visitors accepted them at face value. Some imaginative collectors claim to have found these items in crypts, noble estates, or old monasteries. But when modern historians and archaeologists examined them, most became fakes, crafted for jokes or curiosity rather than actual use. Aside from being historically dubious, the belts themselves were utterly impractical. If you've ever looked closely at one, you'll notice the rigid metal parts, the small holes, and the giant lock, all of which would be a health nightmare. In an era when people bathed less than twice a season and feminine hygiene was poorly understood, wearing a hunk of metal for weeks on end would invite infection, ulcers, and all manner of medical disasters. Some accounts even claim women wore these belts for months or years while their husbands were away. But just imagine how one would pee, clean themselves, or even sit down. It quickly becomes clear that this idea doesn't hold up, literally or figuratively. So why do people still believe it? Because the concept is too juicy to ignore. It symbolizes total control, obsessive jealousy, and warped trust. But the reality of medieval relationships was far more complex. Women weren't as passive as often assumed. Despite heavy restrictions, many played roles in managing households, handling finances, and even influencing legal and political matters. Many wives ran estates while their husbands were away and could own property or refuse a marriage without personal consent. Yes, there were injustices and sad stories, but the chastity belt wasn't one of the standard tools of oppression. Instead, fidelity was enforced through social pressure, neighborhood surveillance, religious guilt, and moral punishments. If a woman was suspected of infidelity, she might be shamed publicly, lose inheritance rights, or face trial before her community. But no one locked her up in iron. Instead, they locked her inside an invisible prison of judgmental stares, whispered gossip, and ever-watchful neighbors. Interestingly, some medieval illustrations show chastity belts, but most were satirical or symbolic. In some images, women wear them to ward off predators or as visual commentary on jealousy, not as depictions of real-life behavior. They were tools of humor and exaggeration, not everyday apparel. And like many myths, once the chastity belt was repeated enough, it started to feel real. It still appears in films, games, comics, and clickbait history videos. It gets a little more terrifying, exaggerated, and a little further from reality each time. But if we pause and look at the historical evidence, we see that the chastity belt was more of a theatrical prop than a real part of daily life. A rumor with legs, a story that knew how to adapt, perform, and linger in the imagination. So next time you see a drawing of that infamous iron contraption, don't rush to believe that the Middle Ages were a hellscape of locked-up virtue. It probably says more about the paranoia of later generations than about the actual lives of medieval women. In the modern world, when we talk about birth control, you might think of pills, condoms, IUDs, or even phone apps that track your cycle. But forget all those conveniences and travel back to the Middle Ages, where reproductive control was a strange adventure, full of creativity, guesswork, and, occasionally, genuine health risks. Back then, medical knowledge was rudimentary, and beliefs were primarily based on oral tradition, observation of nature, and sometimes on books written in Latin that no one could read. But the need was still there. Not everyone wanted 10 children, especially when half might not survive the winter. So people began trying everything they could to delay the inevitable. Let's start with the less alarming methods. Perhaps the most common were herbal remedies. Village midwives, herbalists, and older women passed down teas, steam treatments, or direct application recipes. One of the most frequently used was wild carrot seed. It may sound harmless, but this seed contains compounds that can interfere with hormones, and it was considered a natural contraceptive. Women might chew the seeds daily after sex, though the dosage and effectiveness were, at best, uncertain. Another plant was the pennyroyal root. This aromatic herb, often used to repel mosquitoes, could cause uterine contractions when brewed into a strong tea. That meant it could potentially prevent pregnancy or induce miscarriage. Sounds effective until you learn that too much pennyroyal can seriously damage your liver or even cause death. So, in many cases, the result went from no baby to no person. Another folk remedy was dandelion. Its leaves were crushed, mixed with wine or vinegar, and rubbed on the lower abdomen. Others believed that bathing in water infused with mugwort could prevent pregnancy. Was it effective? No one knew. But it gave the feeling of doing something, and that feeling mattered in an age with no options. There was also the early form of the rhythm method. Women still observed body signs without apps or charts, menstrual timing, temperature, or mood changes. They didn't use scientific terms, but they had folk expressions like dry moon week or midwife's resting days to describe low fertility periods. The problem? Menstrual cycles aren't always predictable, and being off by a day could mean a baby arriving during the snow season. What about mechanical methods? Yes, and they weren't pleasant. Some accounts describe women mixing clay powder, beeswax, or even saliva with herbs to form a DIY barrier, which they inserted before intercourse. Suppose you're cringing. Good. These were unhygienic, uncomfortable, and unregulated. Midwives also advised using cloth soaked in vinegar or strong alcohol as a kind of spermicide. But you don't need a medical degree to realize that applying alcohol or acid to one of the body's most sensitive areas is a recipe for infections, burns, and severe pain. Then we entered the magical territory, where things took a strange turn. Some believed that placing a stone washed in rainwater under a new moon beneath their pillow would prevent conception. Others swore by tying a string with 9 knots around their ankle. In certain places, women were told to jump backward 3 times after intercourse to shake off pregnancy. Even food came with spiritual implications. Some believed that eating hot foods, like garlic, onions, or strong wine, could invite the soul of a child, meaning, one wrong bite, and you'd unknowingly signed a cosmic baby contract. The mix of belief, food, and folklore created a tangled logic where having a child became almost mystical. Of course, the actual effectiveness of these methods was very low, but their importance didn't lie in how well they worked. It lay in the effort. In a world without official choices, no pharmacies, and no OBGYNs, women still tried to take control of their bodies. They listened to each other, shared knowledge, experimented, and preserved wisdom as a quiet resistance to fate. Despite the limits of knowledge, religion, and social pressure, medieval women found ways to negotiate with destiny. Through bitter teas, scraps of cloth, or whispered prayers by the hearth. Today, we might laugh at these odd methods. But beneath the bizarre surface is a story of longing for agency, resilience under restriction, and the unshakable belief that no matter what the world imposes, there are always small, defiant ways to say, "This body is mine." Medieval times may be remembered for knights, cathedrals, and notorious plagues, but amid failed harvests and endless wars, people still cared deeply about passion. Not just love or marriage, but raw, unfiltered desire. And like every culture in history, medieval folk were curiously, sometimes hilariously, invested in boosting their vital energies. The problem was that medieval medicine had no Viagra, no synthetic hormones, and no personal consultation hotline. So people turned to nature, folklore, and a healthy dose of wild imagination. Let's start with the most popular so-called aphrodisiac, eggs. Eggs symbolized life and fertility, and, for some reason, were believed to heat the blood. In many households, hard-boiled eggs were served on the wedding night as a suggestive appetizer. Some even boiled them with cinnamon or ginger and a touch of honey, calling it the lover's tonic. Whether it worked was uncertain, but at least it tasted nice. Next up, nutmeg. Imported from the East and ridiculously expensive, nutmeg carried an aura of mystique. It was believed that sprinkling nutmeg into wine and drinking it before bed would lead to a very ready morning. Some monks even recorded spicy potion recipes with nutmeg, ginger, and honey. warning that excessive use could awaken the demon of desire. Ginger was another crowd favorite. To warm the body literally and figuratively, ginger was crushed and mixed with wine or flour to make spicy sweet cakes. These were often gifted to newlyweds as a subtle wish for a productive honeymoon. If you ever received 3 ginger cookies from your neighbor, she was very invested in your bedroom affairs. But they didn't stop at spices. Some opted for livelier ingredients. Oysters, eels, and herring were considered slippery, supple, full of vitality. These foods commonly appeared at wedding feasts, no explanation needed. Unfortunately, poor storage methods also frequently led to food poisoning, forcing many couples to postpone their big night because someone was curled up in bed groaning from the eel and onion casserole. Beyond cuisine, certain herbs and roots were legendary for their supposed powers. Epimedium, known as horny goat weed, with a name that leaves little to the imagination, was steeped into teas, ground into powders, or smeared on the chest like a salve. Records claim both men and women used it, though dosages varied wildly, and results ranged from vigorous to fell asleep immediately. Then there was mandrake. With its human-shaped root, the mandrake was said to radiate strong life energy. But harvesting it came with superstitions. Legend said its roots would scream when pulled, killing anyone who heard it. Some claimed that soaking mandrake root in wine for 7 days and drinking the brew could lead to an unforgettable night. Others only remembered falling off the bed after trying it. Of course, alcohol had its role. Across all cultures, alcohol is known to lower inhibitions, but medieval folk gave it an extra twist. They infused wine with cinnamon, cloves, honey, even black pepper. This potent mix was dubbed lover's wine and used during secret rendezvous. 1 glass might calm the nerves, 3 might lead to an unexpected wedding the next morning. There were also spiritual techniques. Some believed that writing the name of your beloved on paper, folding it, placing it under your pillow for 3 nights, and then burning it under a full moon would create an irresistible pull. Supposedly, the target would suddenly feel butterflies, or at least dream about you. No science backs this up, but belief often outruns logic. Other methods bordered on comic relief, but were seriously documented. In some regions, it was thought that rubbing rosemary on your forehead before bed made you more attractive, or that stuffing time in your shoes would make your stride more seductive. Some placed a tiny piece of rosewater-soaked bread under their pillow, trusting the scent to guide their dreams toward steamy ends. Naturally, there were warnings. Eat too much raw onion, and your inner fire might flicker out. Let a black cat cross your bed before sleep, and you'll feel cold all week. Forget to pray before sipping your lover's wine, and you might suffer heart troubles, though the storyteller never explained exactly what kind. Medieval aphrodisiacs weren't magic pills. They were a mix of hope, belief, a spicy ginger tang, and occasional digestive regret. But behind all the potions and charms lay one timeless truth. Humans have always searched for ways to rekindle passion, even if the only light in the room came from a flickering oil lamp and a questionable eel pie. In the Middle Ages, childbirth wasn't merely a personal desire. It was a societal duty, a religious obligation, and sometimes even a political burden. A couple without children wasn't just seen as unfortunate. They were often thought to be violating the natural order ordained by God. As with many things that medieval medicine couldn't explain, infertility was typically blamed on one of 3 culprits: witches, the will of the divine, or the phases of the moon. In small villages, where everyone knew what their neighbors had for dinner the night before, a couple married for 3 years without a child became a hotter topic than the harvest. Whispers would spread in the marketplace. Perhaps the wife had a cold womb, or the husband had caught a draft in the wrong place. And if the gossip traveled far enough, someone would inevitably suggest that the family had been cursed. Magic wasn't some far-fetched fantasy when it came to reproduction. It was woven deeply into how people made sense of the world. A childless woman might be advised to fetch water from a sacred well on the 7th night of the lunar month and then pour it over her rooftop silently. If that didn't work, The next step might involve circling a willow tree 3 times at dusk, while whispering a spell passed down from her grandmother. Some methods were more practical, but no less peculiar. Sleeping with a sparrow bone in your pocket, wearing a bracelet made of raspberry root, or tucking a warm loaf of bread under your pillow were all thought to attract the warmth of life. These might sound like harmless folk rituals today, but to many medieval couples, they were sacred rites filled with solemn hope. The moon's cycle was believed to play a significant role in fertility. Some thought it was best to conceive under a new moon to ensure a strong, brave son, while the full moon was said to favor dreamy, sensitive daughters. As for crescent moons, it's best to avoid them. They'd lead to incomplete children. But if, after all the chanting and charm crafting, a woman still failed to conceive, society began to look elsewhere for someone to blame. And there was no easier target than another woman, the witch. Witches in the Middle Ages weren't always cackling crones on broomsticks with warts on their noses. Often, they were simply older women living alone, knowledgeable in herbs and prone to muttering cryptic things. If a childless couple lived nearby, rumors would start. Someone might claim to have seen her dropping ashes into a well. Another swore they heard strange laughter from her kitchen at night. Proof wasn't required. A few bad harvests, a cow's stillbirth, and 2 barren marriages were often enough to send an entire village calling for judgment. And during such a trial, anything could be submitted as evidence. A broken hairpin, a strange-looking cat, even a dream someone had the night before. One of the cruelest ironies was when infertile women themselves began accusing others, just to protect their reputation. If a woman couldn't produce children, her best defense was to accuse someone else first. She cursed me. This blame game was brutal but effective, offering a minor illusion of control in a society where women had little power and medicine had few answers. The church, too, played its part in this tangled web of belief. Many priests taught that infertility was a punishment from God for some past sin. Perhaps the couple had been intimate on a holy day or entertained lustful thoughts during Lent. The wife might be told to fast strictly, pray nightly, and refrain from laughing loudly for a whole week. The husband would be advised to confess everything, even things that had nothing to do with childbearing. Still, not everyone believed in curses or divine wrath. Some placed their faith in animals. Midwives might suggest sleeping beside a pregnant goat to absorb its fertility. Others placed hatching chicken eggs under the marital bed. One folktale claimed that if a couple rubbed the belly of a sow about to give birth, the blessing of fertility would pass to them. If all else failed, the pilgrimage was the final hope. Particular churches were said to warm the womb through their sacred relics. Women would journey to these holy sites, touch the reliquary, light candles, drink blessed water, and return home with renewed hope. Even if nothing changed biologically, they felt spiritually comforted, and sometimes that was enough. When a child was finally born, it wasn't just a family celebration, but a communal event. The baby was seen as a gift from heaven, proof that all the rituals, prayers, herbal teas, and moonlit dances around the well had been rewarded. The newborn would be wrapped not only in swaddling cloth, but in the hopes and blessings of an entire village. In a world where science was still a whisper, and medicine barely more than guesswork, these beliefs offered a kind of refuge. They gave people a sense of control amidst the chaos. And whether right or wrong, they allowed hope to survive. And in the Middle Ages, hope was more precious than gold. In the old chronicles, you'll rarely find a chapter that speaks of love between people of the same sex. There are no detailed records of weddings between 2 men or romantic moonlit rendezvous between 2 young women. But that silence doesn't mean those relationships didn't exist. It simply means they were hidden, encoded, and often buried beneath layers of moral language. The Middle Ages had no term like LGBTQ as we know it today. There were no forums, rainbow flags, or safe spaces to live openly. But within cold stone walls, in monastic libraries, or among quiet forest paths, there were still exchanged glances, slanted lettered notes, discreet gestures, and affections that defied the rules society imposed. In large cities like Paris, London, or Florence, there were quiet quarters where those who felt different would find each other. They didn't carry banners or make declarations, but they recognized one another by how they walked, a subtle brush of a sleeve or a seat chosen in a tavern. They had no name for their community but knew they belonged to something unspoken. Among the nobility, some same-sex relationships were disguised as special friendships. Two men could live together for years, share a bedchamber, ride in the same carriage, and still be seen as devoted companions. No one asked questions, because in a society obsessed with honor and reputation, what wasn't spoken aloud didn't need to be questioned. That said, life was far from peaceful for those individuals. Many medieval kingdoms had laws against same-sex acts, particularly between men. These laws carried harsh punishments, from fines to execution, depending on the place and period. The charge was known as sodomy, and the church ranked it among the gravest sins, just beneath heresy and witchcraft. Ironically, monasteries, spaces that forbade relations between men and women, often saw the most same-sex intimacy. Deep feelings naturally formed when men lived together in enclosed settings, or women shared chambers in convents for a lifetime. Some letters between nuns, preserved to this day, are full of tender insinuations and whispered Latin poetry. One even reads, "My heart belongs to the sister who prays with me at dawn, keeps silent with me at dusk, and dreams with me of a heaven without locked doors." In medieval theater, where men played male and female roles, performers often led lives full of nuance and complexity. Relationships between actors weren't uncommon, though the audience never knew the truth. Behind the costumes were vibrant but fragile romances, most faded into silence. Among peasants, things were simpler but more brutal. If two men were caught being affectionate, they could be publicly beaten, tried, or banished from their village. For women, it was slightly different. Society often dismissed female desire, so relationships between women were seen as harmless or ignored, unless someone stood out too much. Even amid danger and limitation, beautiful stories still emerged. Two men buried in the same grave in northern Italy share a headstone carved with the words, "United in the Lord and in life." Two nuns left behind journals expressing their deep bond, writing of how they found light not from candles, but from the warmth of the other's hand upon their heart. And then there are the countless quiet lives, unrecorded by history, unnamed but real, threading silently through the grand tapestry of time. These people did not live to be celebrated. They lived to love as their hearts instructed them. In some regions, small queer communities emerged, offering mutual support, sharing herbs, hiding places, and news of where one could live, even briefly, without scrutiny. It could be a weaving workshop on the edge of town, where two tailors shared a rented room, or a pastry stand where the shopkeeper smiled knowingly at each male customer. Sometimes it was a private ceremony, organized only by themselves, no priest, no law, just a promise exchanged beneath a tree. Though pushed to the margins, this community endured. They loved, wrote letters, painted images, and left behind faint but proud historical traces. The records may have skipped over them, but that doesn't mean they didn't help build the world we know. In an age ruled by rigid beliefs and fear of difference, they still lived their truth, not loudly, but without letting their flame die out. Their lives may be cloaked in the shadows of history, but if you listen closely, you'll still hear hearts beating, softly but genuinely. In the Middle Ages, if you were single, chances are your neighbors would invent all sorts of wild theories about why. They'd whisper that you were cursed, that no one would marry you because you talked to cats, or perhaps that you stared at the parish priest for a bit too long during Mass. While everyone spun scandalous tales about your solitude, the truth was often much simpler. You didn't marry because life just decided that for you. Being single in medieval times wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was usually the result of circumstance, social status, or religious mandate. You wouldn't get to marry if you were the fourth son of a peasant family with no land to divide. Suppose you were a girl without a dowry. good luck finding a husband. And if your faith was strong and your hair clean enough to fit under a nun's wimple, congratulations. You were now honorably committed to a lifetime of celibacy. The church loved celibacy, not out of jealousy, but because it believed desire was a barrier to divine devotion. A good cleric was not distracted by spouses, screaming children, or pillow talk when they should be praying. So priests, nuns, monks, and bishops had to be celibate, at least on paper. This form of celibacy was known as chaste celibacy, a sacred ideal tied to unwavering loyalty to God. In theory, these individuals would renounce all bodily desires, live in silence, fast, sleep little, and pray often. In practice, it is not always so tidy. Some monasteries recorded the occasional monk who mysteriously disappeared for a few nights, or a nun who became pregnant and claimed it was a dream. But since everything was cloaked in solemnity, such matters were usually smoothed over with gentle denial. Not everyone was forced into this life. Some truly desired it. They felt peace in the monastery, rising early for prayer, tending herb gardens, copying sacred texts, and never having to argue over who should wash the dishes. For them, celibacy wasn't loneliness, but holy space, a quiet life of candles, reflection, and self-chosen calm. But many others had no real choice. A poor girl without education, a dowry, or standout looks might be passed over repeatedly. Eventually, her parents might send her to a convent to give her somewhere to stay. She didn't become a nun because of a holy calling, but because no one else called her name. For men, the situation wasn't much better. Without land or wealth, the church became one of the only paths to food, clothing, and respect. The catch? You had to swear not to love, not to marry, and not to linger too long looking at anything, even statues of saints with particularly gentle eyes. Celibacy often wore the mask of stern dignity. When asked about love, a cleric might simply smile and say, "I am married to God." It sounded noble. It sounded holy. But deep down, that same cleric might have longed to hold someone on a winter night. Before his feelings were wrapped tightly in robes and lifelong vows. In some places, single people were seen as suspicious. They were often accused of witchcraft, heresy, or being unnatural, especially those who remained unmarried past a certain age. A woman of 31 without a husband might be called a thorn in God's side. Rumors might swirl that she once loved a knight who died in battle, or that she was betrothed to a spirit in the woods. The less people knew, the more they invented. These individuals had to tread carefully. They couldn't laugh too much, stand too close to men, or, heaven forbid, admit they were happy alone. If they did, neighbors would be convinced they were hiding something. In that world, personal joy outside of marriage was viewed with deep suspicion. Still, celibacy wasn't always sad. Many single people discovered freedoms that the married never knew. They could shop without doubling up. They could sleep until the third rooster crow without being shaken awake. They could embroider, read, or play the lute without sticky children grabbing their sleeves, or a husband yelling, "Where's dinner?" In convents, nuns lived in close-knit communities. They called each other sister, shared beds, prayed together, and cared for one another when sick. Some even kept cats, grew herbs, and enjoyed light wine on weekends. They didn't call it a feminist commune, but in many ways, that's exactly what it was. A self-governed, nurturing, female-led world. Medieval celibacy was a story of both choice and lack of it. Some found peace within it. Others were pushed to the margins of worldly joy. Some swore oaths in faith. Others were forgotten by history. But through it all, they lived, prayed, smiled at the return of spring, and hoped that one day, being single would no longer be seen as a social defect, but as one more valid thread in the rich tapestry of life. When people think of the Middle Ages, they often picture valiant knights, quiet nuns, and meals consisting mostly of watery porridge. Few imagine a far more ordinary, yet strikingly real aspect of medieval life: prostitution. The truth is, in many European cities during the Middle Ages, prostitution not only existed openly, it was legalized, regulated, and even taxed. Yes, you heard that right. Some towns kept official records of prostitutes, designated legal areas for them to work, and even set rules for days off and working hours. In some places, you could walk into a brothel, request a standard service, pay your fee, and receive a receipt, or at least a confirming nod. The main reason authorities legalized prostitution wasn't because they were ahead of their time. It was out of sheer pragmatism. To the officials, if you couldn't eliminate something, the next best thing was to control it. Prostitution was seen as a necessary evil that protected virtuous women from harassment, calmed the urges of unmarried men, and, equally important, brought revenue to the city. In cities like Avignon, Nuremberg, Paris, or Venice, brothels were located in specific districts, usually near ports, markets, or city outskirts. These were where prostitutes lived, worked, paid rent, and submitted weekly taxes. They had set business hours and, in some places, were required to wear special clothing to be recognizable. For example, yellow scarves, red-trimmed hats, or plain fabrics to avoid being mistaken for noble women. Many towns even appointed brothel managers, often older women called madam, or in French, abbesse. Their job was maintaining order, collecting bed fees, resolving disputes, and, if needed, stopping fights between girls over loyal customers. Some of these women had years of experience in the trade, and managing a house full of workers was essentially running a small business, just without a signboard out front. Some towns even implemented periodic health checks for prostitutes. While far from modern standards, this was a noteworthy attempt to curb disease. Those suspected of illness could be quarantined, banned from working, or reassigned to other duties like cooking or cleaning within the same brothel. Despite what sounds like official recognition, prostitution in the Middle Ages was far from respected. These women were still looked down upon, excluded from many aspects of public life, and often barred from religious rites like communion or confession, unless they had repented. They existed on the margins, part of the social machine, yet still considered impure. In some regions, prostitutes were required to leave the city during Holy Week, stay away from churches, and weren't allowed to sit at tavern tables with married women. They were a familiar yet forgotten group, needed but scorned. It's important to remember that not everyone entered the profession by choice. Many women were forced into it by circumstance, orphaned, thrown out of homes, jobless, or tricked. They often had no other options. Some were former servants who had been assaulted by their employers and then dismissed, unable to find other work due to their reputation. Others were enslaved people sold into brothels, especially in port cities. These women had no right to refuse clients, no control over their earnings, and were treated as property. By contrast, free prostitutes, though fewer, had some autonomy. They could choose clients, negotiate prices, and even save money in hopes of one day buying their freedom. Surprisingly, some women saw the profession as simply a job. They dressed carefully, learned to please clients, and entertained with songs, dances, or jokes to keep patrons returning. Some gained fame in their regions, receiving dinner invitations, gifts, or long-term support from wealthy men, akin to being an official mistress. However, the situation wasn't always stable. There were periods when the church pushed harder to ban prostitution altogether. Some towns shut down brothels, forcing women to return to a pure life. The result? Prostitution went underground, scattered across the city, and created more risks and complications. Through all these ups and downs, medieval prostitutes remained an integral, if often ignored, part of society. They weren't the heroes of history books, but they were witnesses to everyday realities the chronicles rarely dared to mention. They may not have been honored in stone or song, but their names appeared in tax ledgers, legal complaints, and the quiet prayers of single mothers, hoping their children would never end up in the same trade. And strangely enough, in a world choked by rigid morals and rules, they were among the few women who earned a living entirely independently. You might imagine that a medieval brothel was a dark, secretive place, hidden behind heavy iron doors and tucked away in narrow alleys. But the truth is a little more surprising. Brothels were a fully public part of urban life in many European cities of the Middle Ages. They operated as openly as a bakery, with posted hours, a list of services, regular customers, managers, and sometimes even price boards. In other words, if you lived in Florence, Paris, or Bruges in the 14th century, you could stroll through the morning market, buy some cheese, visit your blacksmith friend, and casually walk past a brothel, without needing to sneak into a red light district or pull your hood low. It wasn't scandalous. Brothels existed alongside ordinary homes, sometimes next to churches, near tax stations, or across from a bakery. This openness didn't stem from special tolerance. It came from practical need. Prostitution was treated as a necessary service, meant to channel energy, maintain order, and, perhaps most importantly, prevent greater sins. Authorities argued that if men had a safe outlet, they'd be less likely to commit worse offenses elsewhere. And if it brought in tax revenue, all the better. As a result, many brothels operated like legal businesses. There was a manager. There were staff. Someone handled cooking, cleaning, and laundry. There was a doorman. Some brothels even took reservations, like calling ahead for your favorite pastry. Others had loyalty cards for regulars, offering perks like discounts or an extra small cup of wine. If you spoke to a local living beside a brothel, you might hear something practical. They're quiet. The girls pay rent on time, buy my bread every morning, and sometimes help the old lady down the street carry water. To the average townsfolk, a brothel was like a tavern. You might not go in, but you knew it was there. And you could tell who just came out by the way their shirt sat crooked on the shoulder. That said, not all brothels were the same. There were upscale establishments that catered to merchants or nobles. These had velvet drapes, scented candles, musicians playing string instruments, and honeyed wine poured into silver goblets. The women there were well-dressed, trained to tell stories, sing, and even speak a bit of Latin to impress the clientele. On the other hand, at the working-class level, a brothel might just be a two-story wooden house with a few broken chairs and blankets folded neatly in the corner. No honeyed wine, but perhaps a warm bowl of porridge and a seat by the fire. Customers there weren't looking for refined seduction. They wanted a brief stop, a few kind words, and to be treated better than they were out on the street. Few people know that many brothels had surprisingly strict internal rules. Women couldn't work beyond certain hours, were entitled to rest days each month, and could refuse clients if they felt unsafe. While the law didn't always protect them, these house rules offered a degree of shielding in an otherwise vulnerable environment. Some brothels had discreet service menus, posted behind closed doors, written in local dialects with code words. Special offerings might be marked with symbols: a shoe, a daisy, a crescent moon, to be subtle to outsiders but clear to insiders. Much like bakeries had regulars, brothels had loyal clients. These men didn't just come for entertainment. They came for conversation, to be called by name, to feel remembered. For many lonely or unmarried men, a brothel was the only place they felt heard. These relationships were commercial and emotional, small human connections in a cold world. And just as bakeries had slow days, brothels had quiet seasons. Religious holidays, fasting periods, or bitter winter weeks meant fewer visitors. During those times, the women sewed, washed blankets, wrote letters to sisters in nearby towns, or tallied household expenses. They weren't just sellers of affection. They were women managing every coin, every meal, and deeply aware of the cost of survival. Sometimes, brothels became places of refuge. A girl disowned by her family, a single mother no one would hire, or a victim of assault who had nowhere else to go. Some came to the brothel as a last resort. No one dreamed of entering the trade, but some found within it a warm meal, a few friends, and temporarily, a roof over their heads. Of course, not all brothels were safe. Traffickers ran somewhere women were forced to work, never paid, and denied the right to leave. But beside those shadowy places were others that ran with order, structure, guards, hot meals, and someone to remind you to stay hydrated. It was a complex world, impossible to paint in pure light or darkness. A medieval brothel was neither romantic nor a symbol of liberation, but was very real. It was like a bakery in that it provided something people needed, whether a hug, a story, or just the feeling that someone was listening. And it operated with a mix of order and chaos, laughter and fatigue, business and vulnerability. When you think of the medieval church, you might picture towering cathedrals, echoing bells, and solemn priests preaching virtue beneath stained glass light. But if you took a few steps beyond the church gates and wandered into the alley behind, you might encounter a very different scene. A row of modest brothels, built squarely on land owned by the church. As paradoxical as it sounds, this was a shocking yet well-documented reality across many parts of medieval Europe. While the church publicly preached against lust, condemned carnal sins, and labeled prostitution as a stain upon the soul, it was simultaneously collecting rent from buildings being used precisely for that purpose, often as regularly and efficiently as any tithe. The reason wasn't spiritual, it was simple economics. The church in the Middle Ages owned vast swaths of land, fields, forests, homes, workshops, taverns, and yes, entire rows of buildings rented out to women who sold companionship to survive. These properties might have been bequeathed by dead knights, donated by guilt-ridden nobles, or quietly absorbed over time. And when a parish or abbey found itself holding real estate in a bustling market district with particular local demands, it didn't demolish those buildings. It collected rent. Of course, no one wrote proceeds from prostitution in the ledgers. These were listed as miscellaneous residential income, or maintenance fees from suburban tenants. But locals knew exactly what those houses were for. They just didn't say it aloud. Some clergy even justified the arrangement cleverly. They argued that if vice couldn't be eradicated, it was better to keep it within sight, where it could be supervised. If prostitution occurred in church-owned buildings, at least the church could ensure the women were safe, the clients weren't violent, and disease could be better controlled. It's a tidy argument, until you realize they also accepted payment without delay and never forgot to charge interest. This put certain priests in a moral bind. On Sunday mornings, they would thunder from the pulpit about the temptations of the flesh, the lures of the devil, and the decline of public morals. Then, by afternoon, they'd be signing rent receipts from Agnes of number 7 behind the church. A woman everyone knew ran a particularly successful establishment. Some parishioners began to question the contradiction. Anonymous letters were sent. Sarcastic prayers were scribbled in margins like, "Dear Lord, please enlighten the landlord of number 5 Wood Street, that he might discover the left-hand room is used for rather difficult-to-explain purposes." Such remarks were typically ignored. The church had its ways of separating financial logic from divine doctrine. Some clergy genuinely claimed ignorance. They inherited properties and leased them out without asking too many questions. When complaints came, they acted surprised, plastered over walls, replaced house signs, or simply asked the tenants to keep it down after 9 p.m. But the truth was never far. Brothels renting church land often operated legally, paid taxes, and contributed to local charitable causes. One famous madam in Cologne reportedly donated to the cathedral's roof repairs after a fire, on the condition the priest wouldn't mention her name in the Thanksgiving Mass. Locals might shake their heads, but few voiced strong objections, because everyone knows money is money, from meat, bread, or comfort. As long as the church stayed lit, the bells rang, and Mass was held, the source of income, however suggestive, was quietly overlooked. For the women renting these places, church-owned property could offer a strange sense of security. They believed the landlord wouldn't dare abuse them. God was watching. Some even said living near the church helped them keep their heart kind. If they sinned, they only had to walk a few steps to confess. One woman joked, "If I sin at 9 o'clock, I'm forgiven by 9:15. That didn't make their lives easier, but it gave them a peculiar shelter. In a world of scorn, they found refuge beneath a roof, painted with piety, but ran like a business. To modern ears, the idea of brothels and churches sharing a property line may sound absurd. But to medieval minds, it was just life. Morality wasn't always pristine. Faith could soar, but pockets needed filling. And between ideals and reality stood a bridge called compromise, sometimes stamped with red wax by the very hand of a robed priest. No matter the era, one truth holds firm. Everyone has to pay rent, even if that rent is collected from a house where moans echo nightly and the sign on the door hangs crooked on purpose. Suppose you lived in the Middle Ages and woke up feeling oddly exhausted, with a strange rash or itching in a place not exactly convenient to scratch in public. Well, condolences. You may have fallen victim to what the priests called a punishment of the flesh. In those days, sexually transmitted infections weren't just medical issues. They were considered divine verdicts. People believed that illness was the result of sinful behavior. If you lived purely, God would keep you healthy. But if you'd recently found pleasure behind a stable or in a darkened alley, any suspicious bump wasn't just a health concern. It was a warning sign from heaven. The most commonly reported illness was something referred to as holy fire, which we now understand to include conditions like syphilis or gonorrhea. However, since medieval medicine had no concept of bacteria or viruses, all symptoms were broadly filed under rot of the soul and body. Some thought it came from eating too much red meat. Others blamed laughing while kissing someone who wasn't your spouse. There were no clinics and no standard prescriptions. If afflicted, you'd visit a local healer or apothecary and be given a bizarre and slightly explosive concoction. Perhaps a poultice of sulfur powder, bitter root, morning urine, and mud from an ancient shrine. You'd be instructed to drink, apply, or steam it, depending on the advice. And of course, pray harder. Some sought redemption in the church rather than in a medicine chest. They confessed, not to be healed, but to be forgiven. To them, illness was evidence of divine disappointment. Many would kneel for hours in confessionals, sweating not from guilt but from fever. The priest, frowning thoughtfully, might assign penance, fasting, sleeping on stone floors, or dragging a wooden cross around the village to purge sin through suffering. Some were ordered to abstain from intimacy for 6 months. Others were told to bathe in holy water every morning, and some were advised to sleep separately from their spouses, until the breath of sin no longer echoes through the night. These rituals were meant to cleanse the soul, but they did little for the lesions in one's groin. And for women, the burden was far heavier. A man with an infection could hide in the tavern and wait for it to pass. A woman? If discovered, she might be branded as the source of all uncleanliness. In some towns, infected sex workers were forced to wear black veils, forbidden to leave home without supervision, or isolated in abandoned chapels to repent until pure. In certain places, houses of penance were built, half hospital, half prison, where infected women were kept, treated with folk remedies and prayer, and not allowed to leave until they were proven healed. Proof, however, didn't mean a clean bill of health. It meant no one in the market had recently dreamt about them or broken into a rash after brushing past. Disease became a reason for judgment, blame, and punishment. If a child was born deformed, people might question whether the mother had once loved someone other than her husband. If a man seemed weak or frequently ill, rumors might spread that his wife had absorbed sin overnight. These whispers had no basis but spread faster than any plague. In Sunday sermons, priests used illness as a cautionary tale. Behold, he limps for life because of adultery. Or, she once laughed too freely in the tavern. Now she lives in the attic. These stories became medieval urban legends, passed from old herb sellers to young choristers. Some tales ended in tragedy. People were so convinced of their guilt that they began to punish themselves. They whipped their backs each morning, slept on stone, and avoided joy and warmth. They believed that only by inflicting pain on themselves could they atone for what had been done in the dark. Sometimes they didn't die from disease, but from exhaustion in their quest for divine pardon. Yet not everyone bowed to shame. One village elder, accused of illness simply for appearing too cheerful at the market, was told to confess her unorthodox contact. She replied, "If all I did was itch, then may God have mercy on those who scratch every day." The entire church fell into a stunned silence, followed by reluctant laughter. She was released, not because she was innocent, but because no one knew what else to do with her. Medieval society was where the boundaries between sickness and sin, body and soul, were constantly blurred. People lived between fear and faith, ointment and holy water, and quiet confession and public shaming. And yet, they kept living. They still loved, erred, and hoped for forgiveness, not just from God, but from the neighbors whispering about them behind the hedge. In the Middle Ages, committing a sexual transgression wasn't just a private matter. It could easily become the highlight of Sunday morning, complete with an audience, church bells instead of fanfare, and a live broadcast whispered by the bread vendor next to you. If you let passion override reason, or got caught kissing someone who wasn't your spouse behind the grain barn, it was only a matter of time before you ended up on the church's stage. Punishment didn't always come from the law, but it almost certainly came from the priest and the community. Carnal sin was viewed as a crime that damaged the collective soul. You weren't just offending God, but tarnishing the purity of the village, the church, and sometimes even the dignity of the wooden crucifix in the market square. The most common form of penance was public confession. That meant appearing before the community, often during morning mass, standing outside the church, or, if lucky, just inside, and announcing your sins in a clear and humble voice. Sometimes the priest would read it out for you if you were too shaky, but the wording couldn't be avoided. For example, "I, William, allowed myself to fall into temptation with Marjorie, who was not my wife, on Tuesday night, in the oat barn. I seek forgiveness before God and this community." Sounds simple, until you imagine saying it with Aunt Mildred in the front row, grinning with glee, and two kids giggling uncontrollably when they hear the words, "oat barn." To heighten the educational effect, sinners were often made to dress plainly. Men wore coarse tunics and no shoes, and sometimes had to go shirtless, with a cloth covering and a rope around their waist. Women wore gray robes, no adornments, and hoods that covered most of their faces. Both sexes had to kneel, stand, or walk circles around the church, depending on the severity of their sin and the priest's mood. More serious offenses might involve kneeling in the rain or standing in the bustling town square holding a candle the size of your forearm while repeating your confession. Some churches had a literal chair of shame placed in front of the altar, where the sinner had to sit silently through the entire service as a living reminder of divine disappointment. For clergy, the consequences were harsher. A priest caught in scandal could be stripped of his vestments, exiled to some remote chapel, or, in particularly solemn cases, subjected to soul arrest, meaning he was confined to a prayer cell, barred from teaching or speaking except through prayer. Nuns faced forced isolation, complete fasting, and daily written confessions in black ink on coarse parchment. As harsh as all this may sound, many felt relieved after the ordeal. Once you completed your public penance, you were reintegrated, considered reconciled with God, and allowed to return to daily life. Sure, the fishmonger's wife might still side-eye you for a few weeks, but at least you were no longer the source of divine misfortune. That said, public penance had a strong performative element. Sometimes, it was indistinguishable from amateur village theater. Some wept dramatically, others trembled so much they dropped their candle on their foot. One might kneel, stand again, and issue extra apologies until the priest finally sighed. "Enough, my child. The Lord hears you." And of course, some stood silently, fists clenched, enduring the ordeal like stoic warriors, only flushing slightly when someone whistled from the back pew. Other forms of penance included pilgrimages, community labor, altar donations, or, most charmingly, offering chickens to the church. Gifting chickens became so common that one priest in Brittany wrote, "Confessions we have plenty, but the kitchen never lacks hens." These chickens were then roasted during feast days, and no one ever asked which sin they came from. Some punishments were creative. Certain towns required the sinner to walk through the village beating a drum for 3 days, wearing a sign that read, I followed my heart instead of my brain. Others had to sing penitential hymns in the market square, while locals listened with the polite approval usually reserved for street performers. Naturally, some tried to escape it. They bribed scribes not to record their names in the confessional ledger. They faked illness, claimed madness, or fled town altogether. But if caught, the punishment doubled. Now they were guilty of sin and dishonesty before God and the community. In the Middle Ages, sins of the flesh were never just personal burdens. They were public spectacles, exposed, discussed, judged, and eventually atoned for through whatever means the church or village imagination could muster. Yet the very public nature of it all created a strange cycle of mercy. You sinned, were punished, and were forgiven. Maybe you knelt in shame on the cold stone the morning while two kids snickered mid-breakfast. But by evening, someone handed you a cup of wine to toast the saint's feast day. And the next morning, gossip shifted to whoever was just caught in the cowshed. Because between fire and brimstone sermons and whispered confessions, life went on. Messy, forgiving, and all too human. In romantic tales of the Middle Ages, you often encounter the sweet image of an innocent maiden, a valiant knight, and a festive wedding beneath the chiming of church bells. But people rarely speak of what happens next. Specifically, when that knight dies in battle, succumbs to the plague, or gets kicked in the chest by a disgruntled ox while taking off his armor. And just like that, the maiden becomes a widow. Life shifts from rosy romance to a palette of rites, calculations, and the occasional unexpected awakening. The medieval widow was a complex figure. She wasn't just a woman in black walking slowly behind a funeral procession. She had to navigate the law, community suspicion, and probing glances, some out of pity, others out of opportunity. When a husband died, the first question wasn't, "Is she all right?" but "What did he leave behind, and who gets it?" Medieval law loved a good inheritance puzzle. A widow often didn't automatically inherit her husband's entire estate. Depending on the region, social rank, and family situation, the property might go to the son, the husband's brothers, or even the church. Some widows were forced to leave the home they had lived in if they lacked clear documents or the blessing of a newly appointed male guardian. However, if the late husband was a prepared nobleman, his wife might receive a dower, a designated portion of wealth to secure her livelihood. With that, she could rent a home, live independently, or, more surprisingly, remarry strategically. Remarrying a widow wasn't just about feelings. For men, marrying a wealthy widow was a quick path to acquiring land or political clout. For women, remarrying could be the only way to avoid ending up in a convent or living off relatives. But some chose not to remarry. And that's when the gossip started. A woman living alone in the Middle Ages was considered suspicious. If she was too beautiful, she was accused of witchcraft. If she was too wealthy, people whispered she had a young lover. If she was too quiet, surely she was hiding something. A widow was seen as unclaimed land that everyone thought they could sow, but she was the one choosing what to plant. Some widows chose to live apart from others, not to grieve endlessly, but to manage life on their terms. They ran households, hired laborers, leased land, and operated weaving workshops, taverns, or bakeries. In some areas, widows were the only women legally allowed to sign contracts, file lawsuits, or represent their families in village councils. Having once been married, they were considered worldly, no longer naive girls needing supervision. Ironically, only in widowhood could a woman finally be treated as an adult. Of course, emotional needs didn't vanish. Widows longed, remembered, and felt lonely, just like anyone else. However, expressing that could get them labeled as improper. A widower could remarry within weeks and be pitied. A widow who smiled at someone in the market might be gossiped about for an entire harvest season. As a result, many widows turned to discreet companionships. They might have a gardener friend who helped tend the yard, a blacksmith who was always conveniently around to fix the fence, or a fellow widowed cousin to share a bed with during winter. These weren't formal marriages, but they were real, enduring, and often deeper than any relationship that came with church paperwork. Old chests have yielded letters from widows to their hunters, asking them not to bring gifts, only their voices. Some older women lived joyfully into their 70s or 80s. Their secret was only revealed when the shepherd died, and her funeral was filled with wildflowers from a field no one thought anyone tended. In certain towns, widows formed small households, living together, growing herbs, sewing, and raising chickens. Outsiders called them the women without husbands. They called each other those who once loved. They shared stories, remedies, and secrets of the past. One once said, 10 years with a husband taught me little, but 3 years with other widows? I learned how to negotiate, keep accounts, and lock the front door properly. Many became matchmakers. They knew what men wanted, what women needed, and where the line should be drawn. Others became babysitters, herbalists, or storytellers, because no one tells a story like someone who has lost everything and still knows how to laugh. Medieval widows were not merely victims of fate, they were survivors, adapting to the rigid codes of their world while quietly pursuing their desires. Some remarried out of necessity, others wore black forever like armor. Some fell in love again, quietly, and some chuckled in the dark, remembering the first time they fixed a lock with their hands. Because after all, what follows grief isn't always tears. Sometimes, freedom comes next. The kind they never had while living in someone else's shadow. In the Middle Ages, society was so rigidly stratified that if you happened to take off your shoes in the wrong spot, you might have just violated someone's noble privilege, especially if their name included a D somewhere. Your class didn't just determine what you ate or wore, it shaped your entire experience of life, including your sex life. And if you were a peasant slurping watery porridge, condolences. The noble across the hall wasn't just dining on roast meat nightly. He could also break the rules without even being named. While ordinary folk were expected to confess if they accidentally kissed someone who wasn't their spouse, lords might have entire harems of unofficial mistresses, illegitimate children, and serving maids who were selected, less for their cooking skills and more for their availability. And sometimes even the local church looked the other way. After all, he did pay for that bell tower. It wasn't that noblemen had greater desires, it was that they had the power to go unpunished. When a tenant farmer committed a sexual indiscretion, he might end up in public penance, wearing rough clothes and standing in the marketplace with a placard reading, "I have sinned." But if a nobleman caused trouble with the blacksmith's daughter, the outcome was usually a sack of silver sent to her family and a vague promise, "If the child has my hair, I'll see to it." Many lords treated sex like a fringe benefit of power. Some places even whispered about the right of the first night, the supposed right of a lord to sleep with a bride before her husband on their wedding night. While historians debate whether this was ever formal law or just folklore, it certainly reveals how starkly people perceived the sexual hierarchy. The rich got priority even in the bedroom. And what about noblewomen? They had their form of privilege. While a common woman could be publicly shamed, or worse, if she was discovered to be unpure, a noble lady with indiscretion might be sent to a convent for a few discreet months until the matter passed. A distant cousin could adopt her child, and she'd return to society with her pearls and title intact. That said, not all nobles exploited their power. Some genuinely fell in love with their servants. Some noble commoner couples stayed together quietly for life, despite never being listed in any family genealogy. But those were the exceptions in a system where law and morality often bent, or gilded themselves, when they reached the upper classes. In grand castles, female servants were often expected to serve, far more than candles and shampoo. These women couldn't easily say no. When your boss is your landlord and meal ticket, refusal could mean homelessness, starvation, or ruin. A nobleman's wink could spark rumors throughout the hall, while the maid had to pretend she didn't hear a thing, just to survive. Clever lords wrapped their intentions in polite phrases. They didn't say, "I want you in my bed," but Would you care to keep me company after supper? Or, shall we look over my art collection privately? Everyone understood. No one dared to say it out loud. The wisest maids would smile faintly, bow, and pray he'd fall asleep before trying anything. The church, supposedly the conscience of society, often remained conspicuously silent. When a noble was funding the cathedral, casting the church bell, and donating land to the monastery, it was hard for a priest to preach chastity after dinner in the great hall. Some clergymen even accepted wine and a seat at the feast, disregarding the noble's uncertain arrangements upstairs. This left commoners feeling like laws weren't made for everyone. It was hard to believe in justice if you got fined for holding someone's hand in the market while the Lord kept a rotation of chambermaids. And when that justice stood on a marble altar paid for by the same Lord, that doubt curdled into bitter acceptance. Still, not every noble got away with it. Scandals sometimes made it into the chronicles. Lords' sons abducting brides mid-ride. Duchesses accused of having affairs with grooms. When exposed, the fallout could be dramatic. Demotions, stripped titles, forced convent life. But these were rare. Most incidents faded into tavern jokes, leaving a faint sourness behind for those who listened. Below all the glitter, regular folk still loved, married quietly, and confessed tearfully after a flirtation gone too far at a harvest fair. Meanwhile, the nobility danced through the revelry, leaving behind wine, laughter, and a few quietly broken hearts on straw beds. If you think medieval literature was all dry scripture and endless hymns, allow me to introduce you to some manuscripts that monks copied with flushed ears and trembling fingers. Whether from the chill of the scriptorium or the unexpected heat of poetic inspiration. Because even in an age ruled by laws, penance, and the fear of divine wrath, people were still people, with hearts that fluttered and imaginations that sometimes wandered farther than they should. Sex in medieval literature wasn't described bluntly. You won't find words that resemble anything in modern romance novels. Instead, writers relied on euphemism, a whole world of innuendo, suggestive metaphors, and symbolic phrasing that let them say what needed saying without causing readers to choke on their rye bread. A woman wasn't sexy. She had a waist soft as melody and eyes bright as aged wine. A man wasn't physically obsessed. He longed to rest in the secret garden for which she alone held the key. If the couple got close under the moonlight, the text might say, "The moon bore witness to the union of two flames kindled by God in their hearts and in a place more sacred than the altar." In short, instead of writing, "They had sex," a medieval writer might pen something like, "He entered the blooming garden beneath spring's sighing night, lifting tender branches, his lips seeking nectar like a bee caressing the flower." You might need 3 paragraphs to figure out what's happening, but by then, you're too enchanted to stop reading. One classic example is Roman de la Rose, The Romance of the Rose, a popular 13th century allegorical poem. The story follows a young man navigating a secret garden in pursuit of a precious rose, guarded by personifications like jealousy, prudence, and chastity. Each obstacle he overcomes brings him closer to the rose. Yes, a rose. A very literal rose. Of course. Writers favored this roundabout style because it was safer, less likely to offend church censors, and left room for interpretation. Readers with innocent minds might see only a garden. But those with a little worldly experience knew exactly what was being plucked. Folk poets were often bolder. You might hear some extremely creative comparisons in songs and oral tales. A man might boast that he was strong as a stallion, swift as wind, and knew the path to the honey cave. A girl might keep her treasure locked in a fine wooden chest, opened only by honest hands. And if a couple was caught behind a haystack, the storyteller might say they were discussing matters in a language only straw could understand. Even certain hymns could turn suggestive if you read between the lines. Some expressions of divine love sound suspiciously like whispered sweet nothings, if you conveniently ignore the 3 "O Lord" s at the beginning of each stanza. Medieval artists also had their own ways of sneaking in innuendo in illustrated manuscripts. Rather than painting explicit scenes, they used symbols: rabbits chasing carrots, birds pecking fruit, or even monkeys climbing trees in decidedly uninnocent ways. These were tucked between sacred texts, leaving readers wondering, was this an accident or a wink from a bored scribe? Some believe this was a quiet rebellion by artists and scribes. If they couldn't write openly, they'd draw covertly. They'd smirk through ink and brush if they couldn't declare it. And perhaps even the monks, as they copied these pages, would smile faintly and think, "The Lord understands the human heart, and sometimes the heart needs a little laughter." What's fascinating is how often humor was used as a veil for intimate themes. Many short tales featured bumbling husbands, clever lovers, sly priests, and happy endings where everyone sinned a little, but no one was punished too harshly. In those stories, sex wasn't shameful. It was simply part of life, something to be approached with wit, discretion, and a gentle hand, not erased. That's what makes medieval literature oddly compelling. It doesn't shout, but it doesn't fully hide either. It's not crude, but neither is it sterile. It's a kind of storytelling that pours wine while sketching flowers, letting readers blush quietly as they read by candlelight. Sex, in those texts, wasn't just for arousal. It represented power, longing, social structure, and inequality. But more than that, it was told with lyricism, vivid imagery, and a deep compassion for the human condition. So if you find yourself beneath a small lamp, reading a faded manuscript where the spring garden where she hides her sweet perfume clearly means more than just flowers, congratulations. You've just learned what medieval writers have always known. Sometimes, the best way to tell that kind of story is never to say it outright. The Middle Ages was an era where, if you couldn't win someone's heart with poetry, honeyed wine, or a soulful gaze, you might just try getting a love charm from the old aunt who lived at the edge of the village. And don't think charms were only for fairy tale witches. No, even the gentlest peasants, the shyest maidens, and the most seasoned widows had, at least once, believed that if words couldn't win love, maybe wormwood could. While the church preached that love came from God and should be governed by weddings and lifelong vows, villagers placed their faith in small cloth pouches tucked under pillows, tied with red thread, and sprinkled with dry roots of unnamed plants. This was where folk magic carved out its place. Not official, not lawful, but very much alive. Herbalists, midwives, and those who knew things were the keepers of love's secret recipes. They had no medical degrees or formal training, but they knew exactly what to use when you wanted the boy next door to suddenly dream about you while counting sheep. For instance, do you want someone to notice you? Burn fennel seeds under the new moon and discreetly sprinkle the ash along their usual walking path. It leaves no scent, no trace, only the hope that they'll dream of you picking strawberries in the rain. Charms were made from dried rose petals, knotweed roots, and a drop of rooster's blood. Others were simpler. Recite an incantation 3 times while chewing anise seeds, then blow toward a candle flame. Some believed that tying a red ribbon around your wrist and not removing it for 7 days would make your crush dream of you. Science hasn't weighed in, but gossip spread like an autumn wind. Folk magic wasn't just for starting love. It was also used to keep or end it. If you suspect your beloved is eyeing someone else, you might secretly bake a lock of their hair into a pie and serve it to them on the 3rd day of the week. They'd return to the straight path, supposedly. It sounds a little ominous, but in the medieval mindset, love was something you managed, like a harvest. You planted it, weeded it, and sometimes you had to exercise it. Among the more peculiar spells were sleep charms, not for better rest, but to make someone sleep with you. These involved herbs believed to soothe the spirit, open the heart, raise body heat, or lower resistance to one's natural feelings. Typically, it was wine infused with strange roots, a bit of honey, and a few drops of oil from a night-blooming flower. Too much and you'd get dizzy, too little and regret not trying harder. the oldest love dilemma in the book. Of course, not everyone approved. The church despised all magic, especially of the romantic kind. They saw love charms as an invitation for demons. Some people were arrested just for having a pouch in their kitchen containing dry onion skins and fingernail clippings, an item their aunt said would keep their husband from going to the tavern every night. When questioned, she claimed it was for back pain, but was still accused of dabbling in love sorcery. Many witch trials began with romantic grievances. A man might claim he loved a girl, was rejected, and then mysteriously lost sleep, his hair, and his will to milk cows. So villagers would storm her house, search for anything suspicious, and if they found a jar with a strange smell, good luck. She had just become a practitioner of amorous enchantment. Yet even as the church cracked down, folk songs whispered sly advice. A Welsh tune advised, "If she won't look at you, dip a scarf in full moon well water and place it beneath her pillow." A Bavarian song offered, "If you want his heart soft as butter, bake a loaf at dawn on a misty day and cool it in your apron." These lyrics may sound silly, but they kept many people up at night, waiting for the right weather to save their love with pastry. Some stories were stranger still, turning mirrors upside down at night to catch their gaze, or tucking a comb into a person's tunic so each stroke brings thoughts of you. Of course, none of it was guaranteed, but in a world where most things were up to God, creating a tiny corner of control with sage, ribbon, or whispered charm offered a rare and precious thrill. And I don't think all charm casters were women. Some older men in the village had their methods. They carved roots into little figures, burned laurels in their hearths, or used time smoke to clear the mind before praying for a love unspoiled. It's unclear whether they were searching for a soulmate or trying to forget an ex-wife. But they were nothing if not committed. The folklore of medieval love and lust was a whimsical, shadowy world. One where people feared divine wrath, yet longed for a human hug. They wrote prayers in charcoal, tied strings to sleeping wrists, dropped flower petals in rivers, and counted the ripples to see who loved who more. Because in an age where not everyone had the freedom to choose whom they loved, sometimes a fragrant pouch under a pillow and a whispered chant under the moonlight was all it took to believe the heart still held magic. In the Middle Ages, if you imagined a gallant knight in shining armor, holding a rose and kneeling beneath a castle balcony to swear eternal love, you were probably living in a 12th century French poem. In reality, knightly romance wasn't all about moonlight and roses. Sometimes it didn't happen at all. Most of what we know about chivalric love comes from literary works called romances, long poetic tales about brave warriors and noble ladies with dragons, enchanted forests and sunsets that last several pages. But if you asked a real knight, someone who just slashed through a band of forest thieves and slept in a horse stall for 3 nights, whether he often wrote poetry for his beloved, he might just laugh himself off the saddle. The nobility and educated elite mostly played the idea of courtly love. It wasn't love for marriage. It was more of a complex social performance where a man professed deep devotion to a woman, usually someone else's wife, often the lady of the castle, or even a queen. In other words, he was allowed to swoon, write poems, give gifts, and swear to die for her, so long as he didn't do anything concrete. This kind of love was like a word dance. He'd say his heart was stolen when he saw her walk down the hall with her silver handkerchief. She'd smile, shake her head, and call him foolish, but charming. They both knew the rules of the game. Nothing more would happen. Or if it did, it would be in absolute secrecy, ideally far from the church and best timed while her husband was out hunting. Courtly love kept the upper class entertained. Being adored like a goddess in a world full of arranged marriages and stiff ceremonies brought rare joy. For young knights, pledging to a noble lady gave them a sense of higher purpose, sometimes even better food and lodging during tournaments. Still, most real-life knights weren't penning verses by candlelight. They guarded gates, fought skirmishes, managed estates, and argued with their groundskeepers. They lived in drafty castles, ate dried meat, and dreamed not of kisses, but of sleeping through the night without chasing off bandits. Meanwhile, the maidens described in these tales were painted as angels, golden-haired, fair-skinned, with eyes like doves and voices like songbirds. In real life, they were daughters of lords, trained to sew, manage storerooms, count eggs, and stay quiet while their marriages were arranged. Some were lucky enough to find a dreamy companion, but most were married off by 14, with romantic love arriving only after their third child. Yet the stories of knights and courtly love spread like wildfire. Poets like Chrétien de Troyes wrote of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, tales of forbidden kisses and daring escapes. These were read aloud at feasts, illustrated in manuscripts, and sighed over by noblewomen, not because they believed them, but because they wished the world had more poetry. And truly, literature built a dream world amidst the grime of everyday life. Love on the page gave people an escape, even if just briefly. A poor girl listening to tales of a knight rescuing her from a dragon might smile even as she scrubbed clothes in a freezing river. These legends also gave people room to imagine. They knew love didn't always end in marriage. It could be a glance from a balcony, a poem carved into a tree, a whispered vow both knew would never come true, but still treasured like gold. In a society bound by duty, law, and divine order, metaphorical love became a way to preserve the last sliver of personal freedom. Still, true love did sometimes break through. Some knights married for love, abandoning titles to live with a poor maiden. Some noble women rejected arranged marriages and chose the solitude of a convent over a loveless match. These rare stories lived on as folk legends, proof that real love could grow even in cold, stone places. But for the most part, the knightly love we know today, with roses, armor, and moonlit balconies, is a beautiful fiction, a necessary one, a deeply human one. It permitted people to dream in an age where dreaming was a luxury. So, if you've ever felt like a lovesick knight sighing in silence, take heart. You're part of a centuries-old literary tradition. And if you're still waiting for someone to ride in with gleaming armor and declare, "For you, I'd cross a volcano," maybe take a second look at the neighbor fixing the fence. He just smiled at you and brought fresh bread. When you think of a medieval manuscript, you might imagine thick parchment pages written in brown ink, each word curling in Gothic script, filled with sacred teachings, liturgical hymns, and solemn warnings about what not to do if you still hope to get into heaven. But if you happen to flip to the margins, you may be in for a surprise, because tucked between the prayers and psalms are not entirely saintly illustrations. The world of medieval manuscript illustration is a strange one. While the main text might describe the purification of the soul, the margins below could feature a topless rabbit riding a snail, a naked man chasing a duck with a carrot, or a nun playing the harp, with a part of her body that was never covered in music school. These images are called marginalia, decorative or humorous sketches added to manuscripts, often by the same scribes or illustrators who had just spent months copying out 300 pages of the New Testament by hand. Sometimes the stress relief got a little carried away. Some manuscripts show monks sneaking out on dates, priests dozing off during Mass, or even fully explicit scenes, just with the participants being bears, sheep, rabbits, or men wearing goat heads. Don't assume medieval people believed rabbits could fall in love. They didn't. But they knew how to laugh. And sometimes, laughter was the only way to survive an era with long winters, and your only source of warmth was damp straw. Modern scholars have spent years studying provocative marginalia. There are actual academic books like The Erotic Margins of Medieval Manuscripts, a title that makes even graduate students giggle. These researchers analyze every little flourish, a glimpse of a calf escaping a nun's robe, the flushed cheeks of a saint mid-mischief, and the many, many questionable acts happening just a few inches from Holy Scripture. Why do these images exist? Theories vary. Some say it was inside humor between monks and scribes, a medieval meme. Others believe the sexual imagery was intended as a warning, showing the dangers of lust. But the most convincing theory is perhaps the simplest. Humans can't live on commandments alone. They need art. And art, even in the 14th century, has always been drawn to sex. These risque manuscripts were rarely censored, likely because their readers were nobles, people with wealth, status, and a decent sense of humor. They didn't just read books to be edified. They wanted to be entertained. A beautiful manuscript with cheeky or naughty marginalia was a luxurious, amusing object, perfect for passing around at dinner parties to get a laugh. Some illustrations are still blushingly bold, even today. Like the monk tied to a pillar, while a woman gives him private instruction. Or two nude figures peeking from behind a bush under a caption that reads, "God sees all beneath the light." Maybe it's satire. Perhaps it's a metaphor. Maybe the artist was just bored. What's fascinating is that these drawings rarely relate to the main text. You might be reading a solemn passage on St. Augustine, and right below it, a figure trying on lacy underpants. This creates a strange duality. The main column preaching virtue, while the margins whisper, "Yes, but people are still people." From a modern lens, erotic marginalia can be seen as the ancestor of comic strips. Or, at the very least, a way for medieval scribes to stay sane in a world ruled by rules and rituals. They're proof that not everyone lived entirely by the book. And sometimes, those copying the book also drew the naughty bits. Not everyone appreciated them, of course. Some marginalia were scratched out, painted over, or their manuscripts burned. But many survived, preserved in major libraries, and digitized for modern eyes. Today, you can find them online, shared by scholars and the mildly curious. There are entire social media accounts dedicated to surprising marginalia, complete with captions that make you laugh and learn something about history at 2 a.m. So next time someone says the Middle Ages were dark and humorless, hand them a medieval manuscript. Point to the rabbit hiding in a nun's dress, or the man emerging from a jug in an oddly provocative pose, and say, "This is an era where morality and mischief shared the same page." Because no matter the century, humans have always found a way to doodle jokes between the lines. And if you've ever scribbled something dumb in your notebook margin, don't be surprised if, 800 years from now, someone calls it a rare glimpse into early folk art. If the last part piqued your curiosity with those cheeky little illustrations in medieval manuscripts, then this part will take you even deeper into a world where nothing was too sacred to be doodled on. Because yes, while the main text of these handwritten books brimmed with sermons, psalms, and holy doctrine, the page margins often looked more like the notes of someone barely keeping a straight face. Erotic imagery in medieval manuscripts didn't just reflect human instinct. It was also a secret conversation between the creators of knowledge and their own very human urges. Imagine being a monk, copying the Bible for 10 years, lit only by an oil lamp, with nothing but red and black ink. Drawing a monkey doing something unholy with a banana might save your sanity more than any hymn ever could. Some illustrations are explicitly sexual and hilariously bizarre. A man is lifting his robes to offer fruit from behind, to a woman picking pears. A nun and a dog sit side by side, each holding a book, but their hands and paws are not where you'd expect. And then, there are couples depicted as two-headed snakes cuddling beneath a vine. Whether metaphor or last-minute mischief, you can't help but laugh when you see them. In many cases, these erotic illustrations are subtly slipped between theological commentary, saintly hymns, or liturgical calendars, as if the artist is whispering, "Yes, I'm writing the word of God, but I also live in a body, and this body has an imagination." This playful spirit wasn't limited to religious texts. It spread into medical manuals, astrological books, and even cookbooks. You might find odd annotations in anatomy diagrams like, "This area burns in April," or, "If touched here, expect a sigh." Even in serious scholarly works, artists often let their pens wander toward the risque as long as there was space in the margin. In Latin manuscripts from England and France, everyday objects like a loaf of bread A pouch or a pair of shoes could become stand-ins for more intimate ideas. Offering bread wasn't always about food. Taking off shoes wasn't always about going to bed, at least not alone. The illustrators knew the code, as did their readers, be they monks or nobles, even if no one dared say it aloud. Some manuscripts went even further. Major European libraries still house works labeled unsuitable for children, despite containing purely pious text. One features graphic scenes between humans and mythical beings, elves, angels, and other creatures you'd expect to find in a Sunday sermon only as metaphors. It's as if the artist was testing how far grace could stretch. Curiously, these images were rarely removed. There are no obvious attempts to censor them. No ink smudges, no pages torn out. It seems they were accepted as part of the game. Maybe readers just saw them as harmless. Perhaps the noble patrons who commissioned these books liked a bit of flavor in their scripture. Or maybe, like every weary scribe, they too needed a little something to chuckle about. That said, there's still debate about how to interpret these images. Some historians believe they were subconscious resistance, visual rebellions by artists, scribes, or monks against the suffocating rules of their society. A picture of a drunk friar, a lecherous bishop, or a flirtatious angel might not just be a crude comedy, but a veiled critique of hypocrisy. Others argue they're just bawdy jokes, like medieval bathroom graffiti, only drawn with better ink and centuries of calligraphy training. But regardless of which camp you fall into, one thing is clear. These images feel deeply human. Because alongside all the efforts to record knowledge, teach morality, and preserve sacred law, there was still a part of the soul that just wanted to be silly, to tell a joke, to sneak in a butt, to play. And far from diminishing the manuscript's value, these touches often made them more beloved. They showed a world more real than any sermon alone could capture. And so, these manuscripts survived through centuries of war, reformations, scrutiny, and delight. They remind us that even in times we think of as grim and austere, people still find ways to smirk while reading how to be good. So, if you ever encounter a medieval folio where a snail serenades a rabbit in armor, don't rush to judge the artist as mad. Maybe they were just bored, or laughing and/or sending a wink to readers like you centuries later, reminding you always to leave a small corner of your imagination for mischief. After 29 parts, we've walked together through straw beds and sanctuaries, from whispered confessions to curses of love, from farmstead wedding nights to cheeky marginalia tucked into the edges of sacred texts. Are you still awake? Or did you doze off somewhere around the chastity belt chapter? Either way, thank you for tagging along on this strange and honest journey through the history of instinct, awkwardness, and everything no one ever taught clearly, but everyone was curious about. If there's one thing that lingers after it all, it's this: sex. Whether hidden beneath laws, cloaked in beliefs, or armored with moral code, has always been there. It evolves, adapts, stirs the blush, and refuses to be erased. Medieval people didn't have the internet, dating apps, or modern relationship advice. But they still fell in love, messed up, dreamed forbidden dreams, and flirted through metaphors that spanned 3 lines. They lived in cramped spaces without privacy, where love and sex were tied up in religion, law, and sometimes the weather. And yet somehow, they found a way. They tucked vows under pillows. I gave combs instead of letters. Scribbled naughty doodles in the margins of holy books while whispering scripture with a grin. They wrote about roses, secret gardens, and tents that opened with a breath. They used herbs to woo, moonlight to pine, pies to send messages, and roosters as witnesses. And what's wild is, centuries later, we still recognize it. Not because we're the same as them, but because the core of being human, curious, hopeful, awkward, desperate to feel loved, hasn't changed much. Today, you might text instead of burn mugwort. You might say, "I like you," instead of hiding your scented scarf in someone's sleeve. You can look for dating tips on YouTube instead of visiting the village witch. But the fumbling excitement, the sting of rejection, and the quiet joy when someone notices you, it's still the same as 1,000 years ago. Maybe what makes us smile most is the charming contradiction between what people say and what they do. The church preached restraint, but manuscripts were full of eyebrow-raising illustrations. Villages banned hugging at markets, but weddings still ended with laughter, and babies 9 months after the harvest festival. We share these stories of startled priests, potion-peddling aunties, poetry-writing knights, and noble women who passed handkerchiefs, not to mock, but to remember. Even in the most buttoned-up times, people always found ways to love, to breathe, to be themselves. Because sex, in the end, isn't just a physical act. It's a language of connection, full of metaphors, mischief, and sometimes lessons in kindness. A clumsy kiss in a hayloft may never make it into the history books, but it could warm someone's heart for a lifetime. A sweet pie with the wrong root might not spark romance, but it makes a great winter party story. So tonight, as you turn off the lights, pull up the blanket, and sink into the quiet dark, remember, it's the little things. The whispers in straw, the glances through slatted wood, the cheeky doodles in the margins of serious books that prove people, no matter who or where or when, always find a way to hold on to their truest self. Because in that old world, amid kitchen smoke, chapel bells, and the clip-clop of hooves on dirt roads, hearts still beat for one another. Words still went unspoken. And there were still sleepless nights, all because someone didn't turn around to look.